7 ways empaths lose themselves and mistake merging for real love. Jung's most dangerous discovery wasn't about the unconscious. It wasn't about dreams or archetypes or the collective shadow. It was about a type of person who feels everything, and in that feeling, disappears completely. He called it participation mystique, a state of psychological dissolution so complete that the boundaries between self and other simply evaporate. And here's what he never said publicly. The people most vulnerable to this weren't the cold, the closed off, the defended. They were the sensitive ones, the empaths, the very people our culture now celebrates as spiritually advanced. This video will destroy everything you believe about empathic gifts. Because what if your ability to feel others' emotions isn't a superpower at all? What if it's a sophisticated defense mechanism, a way of avoiding the most terrifying thing a human being can face, becoming a separate self? Jung spent decades working with patients who could intuit things about others that seemed impossible. They knew when someone was lying before a word was spoken. They felt their partner's anxiety in their own chest. They walked into rooms and absorbed everyone's emotional atmosphere like a sponge absorbing water, and almost all of them were slowly dying inside. He documented this pattern in case after case, though he never used the modern term empath. He saw women who had no idea what they wanted because they'd spent their entire lives knowing what everyone else needed. Men who chose careers, partners, entire life paths based on what would please or rescue or fix someone else. Children who became emotional thermostats for unstable parents, learning that their value came from managing others' feelings. These weren't people with strong boundaries who could choose when to open their hearts. These were people with no boundaries at all. Their psyches were like houses with no walls, just open space where anyone could walk in, rearrange the furniture, burn the place down. And they called this love. Jung recognized something that modern psychology has systematically ignored. There's a catastrophic difference between genuine empathy and empathic dissolution. Real empathy happens between two separate, whole people who can feel with each other while remaining themselves. Empathic dissolution is a primitive psychological state where no separation ever developed in the first place. It's not connection, it's fusion. It's not intimacy, it's obliteration. The people experiencing this weren't spiritually evolved. They were developmentally arrested, stuck at the stage of infantile consciousness where mother and child are one undifferentiated unit. Except they were adults now, still trying to recreate that merger with every person they met. And our culture, obsessed with celebrating sensitivity, validating victimhood, romanticizing emotional labor, has told them this is their gift. This is the forbidden truth Jung discovered that no one wants to hear. Most self-identified empaths aren't reading others' emotions. They're experiencing the return of their own disowned shadow material, projected outward and then sensed as if it's coming from someone else. You think you're intuiting what your partner needs. Jung would say you're seeing your own unmet needs reflected back. You believe you're sensing your friend's hidden pain. He'd suggest you're encountering your own exile parts that you've split off and can't acknowledge as yours. The psychic knowing you experience, that's often not clairvoyance. It's psychological enmeshment combined with hypervigilance, patterns developed in childhood when you had to monitor an unstable caregiver's emotional state to survive. Your nervous system learned to track micro-expressions, vocal tone shifts, subtle changes in someone's energy field. Not because you were born with a mystical gift, but because if you didn't detect your mother's mood swing or your father's rage before it exploded, you might not have survived, emotionally or sometimes physically. That's not spiritual attunement. That's trauma adaptation. And the most devastating part? The thing Jung saw destroy people again and again? These empaths built their entire identity around this dissolution. They couldn't imagine who they'd be without it. The ability to feel everything became their reason for existing, their way of mattering, their ticket to being loved. Because here's what no one tells you: if you never developed a self, you have to earn the right to exist by being indispensable to others. If you have no internal sense of worth, you create it through your ability to read, rescue, heal, and manage everyone around you. You mistake your wound for your gift. You confuse your survival strategy for your soul's purpose. You call your codependency cosmic love, and then you spend your entire life wondering why you're exhausted, why you attract users and narcissists, why intimate relationships feel like slow-motion drowning, and why, after decades of giving so much, you have no idea who you actually are. Jung documented this pattern's most chilling characteristic. The people trapped in it genuinely believe they're loving deeply. They experience their self-abandonment as devotion, their boundary dissolution as spiritual openness, their compulsive caretaking as compassion. They cannot see that they're not connecting with others. They're disappearing into them. In his private notes, Jung confessed his own near destruction through this pattern. During his confrontation with the unconscious from 1913 to 1916, his permeable boundaries almost killed him. He absorbed his patient's unconscious material so completely that he couldn't tell what was his and what was theirs. He had prophetic visions that he later realized were participation mystique with the collective, feeling World War I coming, not because he was psychic, but because his ego boundaries were so weak that he was merged with the collective unconscious itself. He came terrifyingly close to complete psychosis, and what saved him? The systematic, agonizing work of establishing boundaries, learning to differentiate, developing what he called ego strength, not ego inflation, but a solid, boundaried self that could relate to the unconscious without being consumed by it. This became the foundation of his entire later work, individuation, the process of becoming a separate, whole person, not cold, not defended, not closed, but distinct, differentiated, real. And he recognized that empaths, people with this dissolution pattern, were attempting exactly the opposite. They were trying to avoid individuation at all costs because becoming a separate self felt like death itself. This video will reveal the 7 specific mechanisms through which empaths lose themselves while believing they're loving deeply. These aren't abstract concepts. They're precise psychological patterns Jung identified through decades of clinical work, each one showing how the empathic gift becomes the empathic curse. We'll explore the developmental origins, why some people develop intact boundaries while others remain merged with everyone around them. We'll examine the neuroscience showing this isn't mystical sensitivity, but trauma-based hypervigilance. We'll look at the devastating long-term consequences: complete identity loss, autoimmune diseases, relationship addiction, and the ultimate tragedy of reaching old age, having never discovered who you were. But most importantly, we'll reveal Jung's roadmap out, the individuation blueprint that transforms empathic dissolution into conscious empathy, the practices that build ego strength without building walls, the path from participation mystique to genuine relating between two whole, separate, sovereign beings. Because the truth, Jung discovered, the one that gives this work hope, is that empathic people who successfully individuate become the most powerful healers, not because they merge and rescue, but because they've learned to be fully present with another's pain without taking it on, to witness without absorbing, to love without dissolving. They become what the world desperately needs: people with soft hearts and strong boundaries, open doors with the ability to close them when necessary, deeply feeling beings who haven't disappeared into their feelings. But getting there requires facing what most empaths spend their entire lives avoiding: the terror of being separate, the grief of never having been truly seen, the rage at decades of self-abandonment, the void that opens up when you stop filling yourself with others' needs and have to confront your own emptiness. This journey isn't for everyone. Most people will watch this video, recognize themselves completely, and still choose to stay in the pattern because the known suffering of dissolution feels safer than the unknown terror of becoming a self. But if you're ready, if you're exhausted enough, if you've lost yourself one too many times, if you can feel something in you screaming that there has to be another way, then this video will show you the path Jung walked himself, from merger to sovereignty, from participation mystique to conscious relationship, from the person who feels everything to the person who feels deeply and remains whole. The question isn't whether you're an empath. The question is whether your empathy is coming from a weak ego that can't hold boundaries or a strong ego that chooses when to open. Let's find out which one you are. Jung gave it a clinical name: unconscious identity, the state where ego boundaries never fully formed, where the self remains partially merged with both the personal unconscious and the vast collective unconscious, where you exist in a permanent state of psychological pregnancy with everyone you encounter. But let's call it what it really is: empathic dissolution syndrome. This is a specific psychological condition, not a personality type or a spiritual gift. It has identifiable symptoms, developmental origins, predictable patterns, and catastrophic consequences if left unconscious. Here's how you know you have it. You walk into a coffee shop and immediately feel the barista's exhaustion in your own body, not compassion for their exhaustion. You literally experience it as if it's yours. By the time you leave, you're drained, and you don't know why. You're with your partner and suddenly feel anxious, deeply, viscerally anxious. You ask them what's wrong. They say nothing, but you know something's wrong. You spend the next 3 hours trying to fix their mood, a mood they claim they don't have, while your own nervous system is in complete chaos. Someone tells you about a problem they're facing, and before they finish speaking, you're already solving it in your mind. Not because they asked, not because you're helpful, but because their discomfort has become your discomfort, and you cannot tolerate it existing in your presence. You can't watch violent movies because you don't just feel for the victims, you become them. The character's pain is your pain. The fictional trauma is your trauma. You leave the theater traumatized by things that never happened to you. You have no idea what you actually want for dinner, for vacation, for your career, for your life. Every decision-making moment reveals a terrifying void where your preferences should be. You default to what others want, not because you're generous, but because you genuinely cannot access your own desires. After social interactions, you need days to recover, not because you're introverted. Introverts can be around people and remain themselves. You need to recover because you've been absorbed into everyone else's psychic space, and you need time to figure out who you are again. You attract the same type of person over and over: users, narcissists, people who need constant emotional management, addicts, anyone whose inner world is chaotic enough to completely consume your attention. And every time you think, this time will be different, this time my love will heal them, you are exhausted to the cellular level, chronically, mysteriously, inexplicably tired, because dissolution is energetically expensive. You're running multiple operating systems at once, yours and everyone else's, and your body is collapsing under the load. This is empathic dissolution syndrome, and Jung understood exactly where it comes from. In normal development, an infant begins life in complete merger with the mother. There is no I and you. There is only an undifferentiated field of sensation and need. Slowly, painfully, through thousands of small frustrations and separations, the child learns, I am not mother. Mother is separate. I am me. This process, Jung called it the development of ego consciousness, is supposed to be complete by early childhood. You're supposed to emerge from the merger, to individuate into a separate being with boundaries, preferences, and the capacity to say no without dying. But for some children, this never happens. Maybe your mother was depressed, and her emotional state was so unstable that you learned to monitor her constantly. You became her emotional regulator before you became yourself. Your survival depended on managing her moods, predicting her needs, making yourself indispensable through your capacity to sense and respond. Maybe your father was rageful, and you developed microscopic attention to shifts in his energy. That hypervigilance to emotional atmosphere wasn't a gift. It was a defensive adaptation. You learned to feel the room's temperature obsessively because if you didn't, you'd be blindsided by violence. Maybe you were simply born with what Jung called thin boundaries, a naturally permeable psyche in a culture that doesn't teach boundary development. You felt everyone's feelings from birth and no one ever taught you. That's theirs, not yours. You can feel with them without becoming them. Maybe you were praised for your sensitivity and caretaking, told you were so mature for your age, when you were actually being parentified. Your family system needed an emotional manager, and you filled that role so well that your identity became inseparable from it. Or maybe, and this is more common than anyone admits, you experienced early trauma or neglect that shattered the normal boundary development process. The self that was supposed to form never did, because there was no safe relational space in which to form it. Whatever the origin, you arrive at adulthood in an infantile psychological state. Not because you're immature in the usual sense. Often you're wildly capable, high-achieving, and competent, but your ego structure never completed its primary task, differentiation. You exist in what Jung called participation mystique, a term he borrowed from anthropology to describe primitive cultures where individuals hadn't separated from the collective, where the tribe's identity was more real than personal identity, where you literally were your role, your family, your community, with no sense of separate selfhood. Except you're not in a tribal culture, you're in the modern world, trying to navigate intimate relationships, career decisions, and psychological complexity with an ego structure that hasn't individuated past the infant-mother merger. And here's the devastating part. You experience this as your greatest strength. You believe your capacity to feel others' emotions makes you more loving, more spiritual, more evolved. You think your inability to say no is generosity. Your lack of boundaries is openness. Your self-abandonment is devotion. You've built your entire identity around being the empath, the sensitive one, the one who understands, the healer, the caretaker, the emotional translator for people who can't access their own feelings. This identity feels precious, special, important, because if you're the empath, you matter. You have a role, you're needed, you belong. The alternative, that you simply never developed a separate self, and this gift is actually a developmental failure, is too devastating to consider, so you defend the pattern fiercely. When someone suggests you need boundaries, you hear, "Stop caring, become cold, shut down your heart." When someone points out that you're being used, you counter, "You just don't understand deep love. You're not sensitive like I am." The ego has a profound investment in maintaining its structure, even when that structure is causing catastrophic suffering, because changing would require admitting that everything you thought was your strength was actually your wound. Jung saw this resistance in patient after patient, the moment he'd suggest that their empathic suffering might be their own disowned material, their own unfelt feelings projected outward, they'd become defensive, sometimes hostile. Because here's the unconscious logic. If I'm not the special empath who feels everyone's pain, who am I? If my gift is actually a trauma response, what's my value? If I stop caretaking others, will anyone want me at all? These questions reveal the core terror. Without the empathic identity, you might discover you're nothing, an empty space, a void with no substance. And rather than face that void, rather than do the individuation work of building a self where none exists, you double down on the dissolution. You find more people to rescue, more pain to absorb, more emotional labor to perform. You mistake your exhaustion for nobility, your depletion for virtue, your disappearance for love. Meanwhile, your body is screaming. Autoimmune conditions develop, the physical manifestation of a self attacking itself because no clear self exists to defend. Chronic fatigue becomes your baseline because you're energetically supporting not just your own life, but everyone else's. Mysterious pain moves through your system because the emotions you're absorbing have nowhere to go. Your relationships follow a predictable pattern. You attract people who need extensive emotional management because people with intact boundaries don't require the level of merger you're offering. The healthy ones sense something off and move away. The unhealthy ones sense an infinite resource and move in. You call this bad luck in love. Jung would call it unconscious complementarity. You're magnetically drawn to people who will consume you because consumption is what you understand. Merger is your relational language. Codependency is the only intimacy you've ever known. And beneath all of it, beneath the exhaustion and the unhealthy relationships and the mysterious illnesses, is the original wound that's never been addressed. You don't know who you are. Not who you are in the existential sense that everyone struggles with, but who you are in the most basic sense. What you like, what you want, what you feel when you're alone with yourself, what your boundaries are, what your values are when they're not borrowed from whoever you're trying to please. There's a void where your self should be, and you've spent your entire life filling that void with other people's needs, feelings, problems, and pain. This is empathic dissolution syndrome. This is the pattern Jung recognized destroys people from the inside out while they believe they're loving deeply. The good news, the only good news, is that it can be healed. The self that never formed can be consciously constructed. The boundaries that never developed can be deliberately built. The individuation that didn't happen naturally can happen through intentional psychological work. But first, you have to see the pattern clearly. You have to stop calling your wound a gift. You have to admit that you're not cosmically evolved. You're developmentally stuck. And that admission requires more courage than most people possess, because it means grieving the identity you've clung to, facing the void you've been running from, choosing the terrifying path of becoming a separate self instead of staying merged with everyone else. Most people won't do it. They'll recognize every word of this description and still choose the familiar suffering of dissolution over the unknown terror of sovereignty. But if you're still reading, if something in you is saying, yes, this is me, and I can't live like this anymore, then you're ready for what comes next. The specific mechanisms through which you lose yourself. The 7 ways you mistake self-abandonment for love. The precise psychological patterns that keep you trapped in participation mystique while believing you're connecting deeply, because you can't heal what you can't see. And Jung's gift was making visible what had been invisible. Let's make your pattern visible. Her name was Sarah, though that's not what mattered to her. What mattered was what everyone else needed her name to be. She came to the therapist's office at 38 years old, professionally successful, seemingly put together and completely hollow inside. The presenting problem, as she described it, I can't leave my relationship even though it's erasing me, and I think there's something wrong with me because I can see it happening and I still can't stop it. The therapist, trained in Jungian depth psychology, saw immediately what Sarah couldn't yet see. She wasn't in a relationship. She was in a merger, and she wasn't being erased. She had never been written in the first place. Sarah's story begins, Like all empathic dissolution stories, in childhood, her mother suffered from depression, not the kind that had a name or received treatment, but the kind that filled their home like toxic gas. Some days her mother was present, warm, attentive. Other days she was a ghost, unreachable, hollow-eyed, staring at nothing. Sarah learned by age 5 that her job was to monitor the ghost, to sense which mother would greet her after school, to read micro-expressions and vocal tones for clues about whether today was a day to be quiet or a day to be entertaining. She became extraordinary at this. By 7, she could walk into a room and know her mother's emotional state before a word was spoken. By 10, she could predict her mother's episodes days in advance. By 12, she was managing her mother's moods better than her mother could. Everyone praised her for being so mature, so sensitive, such a good daughter. What they didn't say, what no one saw, was that Sarah was disappearing. Where other children were developing preferences, Sarah was developing attunement. Where others were learning to say, "I want this," Sarah was learning to sense, "You need that." Where others were building a self, Sarah was building a sophisticated emotional scanning system with no operator inside. She didn't know what she wanted. She knew what everyone else wanted. She didn't know how she felt. She knew how everyone else felt. She didn't know who she was. She was whoever you needed her to be. This wasn't conscious. It was as automatic as breathing. Her nervous system had wired itself for merger, because merger equaled survival. If she could sense her mother's mood, she could regulate it. If she could regulate it, maybe her mother wouldn't disappear. If her mother didn't disappear, Sarah would survive. Except Sarah was already disappearing, but no one noticed, including Sarah herself. College brought brief relief, distance from her mother, new people who didn't know her role yet, a chance to maybe discover who she was. But Sarah had no template for that discovery. Without someone to attune to, she felt untethered, empty, lost. So she found someone. Mark, a brilliant, damaged engineering student with depression eerily similar to her mother's. Within weeks, Sarah was monitoring his moods, managing his emotions, sensing his needs before he voiced them. She felt purposeful again, real, important. This, she thought, is love. They married young. Sarah built her life around Mark's emotional weather patterns. She changed careers because his stress needed her available. She declined friendships because his anxiety couldn't handle her social energy. She monitored his medication compliance, therapy attendance, and daily functioning like she was managing a patient, not partnering with an equal. And Mark, depressed, dependent, and unconsciously willing to be managed, let her. For 15 years, this worked. By worked, I mean, the system maintained itself even as Sarah slowly vanished within it. She was so good at anticipating Mark's needs that he rarely had to voice them, so skilled at regulating his emotions that he never developed those skills himself, so devoted to his well-being that her own well-being became irrelevant. She couldn't remember the last time someone had asked what she wanted. She couldn't remember the last time she'd known how to answer. Her body began failing first. Chronic fatigue syndrome, the doctor called it, fibromyalgia, possible autoimmune markers. Take these medications, rest more, reduce stress. But Sarah couldn't rest. Mark needed her. If she wasn't monitoring his mood, anticipating his needs, managing his environment, he might spiral, he might crash, he might not survive. This is what she told herself. This is what her nervous system believed. This is the story that kept her trapped in a pattern that was killing her, while she called it devotion. The crisis came on an ordinary Tuesday. Sarah woke up and realized she couldn't remember the last time she'd wanted something. Not in the way people usually want things, preferring coffee over tea, choosing Thai food over Italian, but wanting anything at all. having an internal sense of desire that originated from some place inside her, rather than being a response to what someone else needed. She spent the day trying to find that place, asking herself, what do I want? What do I like? Who am I when no one needs anything from me? And there was nothing, an absolute void, like looking into a room that should contain furniture and finding it completely empty. The panic was existential. If she wasn't the person who sensed and responded and managed and fixed, who was she? If she stopped being the empath, did she exist at all? That night, Mark came home in a dark mood. Usually Sarah would immediately attune, adjust, begin the familiar dance of emotional regulation. But this time she was too hollowed out to perform. She watched herself watching him, saw the automatic scanning begin, the micro-reading of his facial expressions, the analysis of his vocal tone, the anticipatory anxiety about what he might need. And she realized she had no idea how she actually felt about any of this. Was she worried about him, or worried about failing in her role? Did she love him, or love being needed? Did she even know the difference anymore? She asked him, "What do you need from me right now?" He looked confused. "Nothing. Why?" "I always sense that you need something. I'm always responding to something I feel from you. But what if I'm wrong? What if what I'm feeling isn't even yours?" He had no answer, because for 15 years, Sarah had never asked him to articulate needs. She'd just met them preemptively. She'd trained him out of self-awareness while training herself out of a self entirely. The therapy began a week later. In the first session, the therapist asked Sarah to describe herself. Not her roles, not mother, wife, professional, daughter, herself. Who she was beneath all the identities built around other people. Sarah's mouth opened. Nothing came out. She tried again. Silence. "I don't know," she finally said. "I genuinely don't know who I am." The therapist, familiar with this pattern, asked a different question. "How do you know what Mark is feeling at any given moment?" "I just know. I walk into a room and I can feel his emotional state, like it's mine." "And how do you know what you're feeling?" Long silence. "I don't think I do. I think I feel what everyone else is feeling. And then I respond to that. But my own feelings? I'm not sure I have any. Or if I do, I can't access them anymore." This was the moment of recognition, the moment Jung called crucial, when they analyze and sees their pattern clearly for the first time, when the unconscious becomes conscious. But recognition alone doesn't heal. It just makes the suffering visible. Over the next 2 years, Sarah's therapy became an archaeological dig, excavating the self that had never formed. The therapist introduced her to Jung's concept of participation mystique, the primitive psychological state where ego boundaries haven't differentiated from the environment. "You're not reading Mark's emotions," the therapist explained. "You're experiencing your own disowned emotional content and attributing it to him. The anxiety you sense in him is often your anxiety. The sadness you're managing is your sadness. You've projected your entire inner world outward and then believe you're being empathic by responding to it." Sarah resisted this initially, fiercely, because if her empathic gift was actually projection, if she wasn't actually special or intuitive or cosmically attuned, then what was she? The therapist pushed. "The question isn't what you are. The question is whether you've ever become anything at all, whether there's a you beneath the scanning and responding and managing." Sarah's dreams during this period were devastatingly clear. In one, she was drowning while trying to save someone who wasn't actually struggling. They were treading water fine, but she kept pulling them down in her panic to rescue them. In another, she stood in a room with no mirrors. Everyone else was vivid and real. She was transparent, invisible, not quite there. The most disturbing dream, She opened her mouth to speak, and everyone else's voices came out. Dozens of people all talking. Through her, using her as a conduit. She had no voice of her own. Jung would have recognized these immediately as individuation dreams, the psyche showing Sarah her developmental arrest, her lack of separate selfhood, her merger with everyone else. The work intensified. The therapist had Sarah practice the most difficult exercise imaginable for an empath in dissolution, sitting with her own experience without responding to anyone else's. When Mark came home stressed, Sarah had to sit with her own feelings about that, not manage his. When her mother called needing emotional support, Sarah had to notice her own reaction, not immediately provide what was needed. This was excruciating. Her nervous system screamed. Every cell insisted that not responding meant death, that setting boundaries meant abandonment, that having her own experience separate from others' needs was selfish, cruel, unloving. She began to recognize the pattern's origin more clearly. As a child, her survival had genuinely depended on managing her mother's emotions. The merger had been adaptive, necessary, life-saving, but she was an adult now, and the pattern that had once saved her was now destroying her. The dreams shifted. New figures appeared, strong, boundaried women who said no without guilt, fierce protectors who guarded doors, images of solid houses with actual walls, not the open space Sarah had been inhabiting. But the waking reality was harder. When Sarah tried to set a boundary with Mark, "I can't talk about your work stress tonight, I need to rest." He looked betrayed, confused, hurt. "You've never said no before. Why now? Don't you care?" And there it was, the confirmation of Sarah's deepest fear. Boundaries mean not loving. Saying no means rejection. Having a separate self means losing connection, except Jung taught that the opposite is true. Real connection only becomes possible between two separate, individuated beings. Merger isn't intimacy, it's the prevention of intimacy. You can't truly love someone you're merged with because you can't see them as separate from you. You can only love your projection of them, your need for them, your use of them to avoid your own emptiness. Sarah stayed in therapy for 4 years total. The first 2 were excavation, uncovering the void where her self should have been. The next 2 were construction, the painstaking, terrifying work of building a separate identity. She learned to track her own feelings first before responding to others, to sit with the discomfort of not managing everyone's emotional state, to say, "I don't know what you need," instead of automatically sensing and providing, to tolerate being called selfish, cold, changed. Mark struggled. Their relationship nearly ended multiple times because the dynamic had been built on Sarah's dissolution, and her individuation threatened the entire structure. He would say, "You're different. You used to understand me. Now you're distant." Sarah learned to translate. "You used to manage my emotions, so I never had to develop self-awareness. Now I have to do my own emotional work, and I don't know how." Some relationships survive one person's individuation, many don't. Because if the foundation was codependency, removing that foundation collapses the house. Sarah and Mark's relationship did collapse, but not immediately. First came a year of renegotiation, of Mark learning to identify and voice his own needs instead of having Sarah anticipate them, of Sarah practicing staying separate even when every instinct screamed to merge, of both of them discovering whether they actually liked each other as 2 separate people or only needed each other as merged one. They discovered they didn't. The relationship had been built entirely on complementary wounds, her need to disappear into caretaking meeting his need to be managed and mothered. When the wounds started healing, the relationship had no foundation. Sarah moved out 3 years into therapy. The separation felt like dying. Her nervous system interpreted it as abandonment, rejection, proof that having a self meant losing love. But slowly, painfully slowly, something else emerged. In the silence of living alone, Sarah began to hear a voice she'd never heard before, her own. She discovered she liked silence, that she wanted her living space minimal, clean, empty of clutter, that she was actually an introvert who'd been performing extroversion for decades, that she liked her coffee black and her food spicy and her evenings solitary. These sound like small things. They weren't. They were the first signs of a self forming. The dreams showed transformation. Where before she'd been transparent or voiceless, now she appeared solid. She had weight, presence, definition. The dreams showed her building structures, establishing boundaries, closing doors that had been open. Year 4 of therapy brought consolidation. Sarah had a self now, not a complete one, not a fully individuated one, but an actual, present, boundaried self. She could walk into rooms without immediately scanning everyone's emotional state. She could have conversations without losing herself in the other person's experience. She could say no without collapsing into guilt. And she discovered something Jung had promised, that individuation doesn't make you less loving. It makes real love possible for the first time. Sarah began dating again, but differently. She wasn't looking for projects anymore, wasn't attracted to wounded men who needed extensive management. The narcissists and emotional vampires that used to pursue her now seemed to sense she was no longer available for consumption. Instead, she felt drawn to people with intact boundaries, equals. Men who had done their own psychological work and weren't looking for a mother-therapist manager disguised as a partner. This terrified her, because relationship with an equal meant she couldn't hide in caretaking, couldn't disappear into the familiar role, had to stay present as herself, vulnerable and visible, but she did it anyway, and discovered that intimacy between two separate people feels completely different from the merger she'd mistaken for love her entire life. It feels reciprocal, sustainable, real. 5 years after starting therapy, Sarah trained to become a therapist herself, specializing in helping other empaths individuate. She could spot the pattern instantly, the dissolved self hidden behind the empathic gift, the participation mystique masquerading as spiritual sensitivity. And she told every client the same thing she'd had to learn. Your empathy isn't the problem. Your lack of self is the problem. And until you build boundaries, you can't actually love anyone. You can only merge, project, and disappear. This is the redemptive arc, the journey from dissolution to sovereignty, from no self to self, from participation mystique to conscious relationship. But it required 4 years of consistent work, 4 years of tolerating the discomfort of boundaries, 4 years of facing the void and building something real where nothing had existed. Most people won't do this. They'll recognize themselves in Sarah's story and still choose the familiar suffering of merger over the unknown terror of becoming separate. But for those ready to do the work, those exhausted enough by their disappearance, Sarah's transformation proves it's possible. The empath can become a person. The person who felt everything can learn to feel herself. The caretaker can discover she's worth caring for, too. It just requires something most people won't give: the courage to face who you are when you're not busy being who everyone else needs. What Jung understood intuitively, neuroscience has now proven empirically. The empathic dissolution pattern isn't mystical, it's measurable. Brain imaging studies over the past 15 years have revealed something extraordinary about people who identify as highly empathic, or empaths. Their neural architecture is fundamentally different, not in ways that suggest spiritual advancement, but in ways that indicate developmental adaptation to early environmental threat. Dr. Ruth Lanius at the University of Western Ontario conducted fMRI studies on individuals with complex trauma histories who also identified as highly sensitive or empathic. What she found was striking. These individuals showed hyperactivation in the mirror neuron system, the networks responsible for simulating others' experiences, combined with significant underactivation in the medial prefrontal cortex, the brain region associated with self-referential processing. In plain terms, their brains were extraordinarily good at experiencing what others felt, while being remarkably poor at knowing what they themselves felt. This isn't a gift. It's a documented neurological adaptation to childhood environments, where attunement to others was survival critical. The brain literally rewired itself to prioritize external emotional data over internal emotional awareness. The mirror neuron research is even more revealing. Mirror neurons fire both when we perform an action and when we observe someone else performing that action. They're the neural basis for empathy, imitation, and social learning. In typically developing individuals, these neurons activate moderately, enough to understand others' experiences without losing track of one's own. But in individuals with empathic dissolution patterns, Dr. Marco Iacoboni's research at UCLA showed that mirror neuron activity was dramatically elevated. These individuals didn't just simulate others' experiences, they became flooded by them. The neural boundary between self-experiencing and other experiencing was permeable to the point of dissolution. When shown images of people in pain, typical subjects showed mirror neuron activation that allowed them to understand the pain while maintaining separation. Empathically dissolved individuals showed activation patterns, suggesting they were literally experiencing the observed pain in their own bodies. This is what Jung called participation mystique, now visible in brain scans, the neurological failure to maintain self-other distinction. The developmental psychology research provides the missing link. How does this happen? Dr. Alan Shore's work on attachment and affect regulation shows that the infant brain develops its emotional processing capabilities through a tuned relationship with caregivers. When caregivers consistently mirror the infant's emotional states, validate them, and help regulate them, the infant develops the neural circuitry for self-regulation and emotional self-awareness. But when caregivers are emotionally unstable, unpredictable, or require the child to regulate them, a pattern called role reversal or parentification, something different develops. The child's brain prioritizes outward attunement over inward awareness. The neural networks for reading others' emotions strengthen massively. The networks for identifying one's own emotions remain underdeveloped. This is neuroplasticity in action, the brain adapting to its environment. And in environments where your survival depends on managing an unstable parent's emotional state, becoming empathically dissolved is adaptive. The child who can sense mother's mood shift before it explodes has a survival advantage over the child who can't. The problem emerges in adulthood, when the adaptation that once ensured survival now prevents individuation, healthy relationships, and psychological wholeness. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk's research on developmental trauma adds another layer. He documented that children who experience chronic unpredictability, emotional neglect, or the need to be hypervigilant to adult moods develop what he calls complex PTSD, a constellation of symptoms including difficulty identifying emotions, permeable boundaries, and chronic attunement to others' needs over one's own. The empathic dissolution pattern appears throughout his case studies, though he doesn't name it as such. These are individuals who describe feeling others' emotions as their own, who can't tolerate conflict because it requires maintaining separate perspectives, who choose relationships based on who needs them rather than who they actually want. Van der Kolk's neuroimaging work shows these individuals have altered activation in the insula, the brain region that processes interoceptive awareness. or the felt sense of one's own body and emotions. When asked to focus on their own feelings, their insulas show minimal activation. When observing others' emotional expressions, their insulas light up intensely. They're neurologically wired to feel through others rather than feel themselves. The polyvagal theory, developed by Dr. Stephen Porges, provides the neurological mechanism for the hypervigilance piece. The vagus nerve has two branches: the ventral vagal, which supports social engagement and safety, and the dorsal vagal, which triggers shutdown and freeze responses. In securely attached individuals, the ventral vagal system activates during social interaction, creating a sense of safety and connection while maintaining physiological boundaries. But in individuals with empathic dissolution patterns, particularly those with childhood trauma, the nervous system remains in a state of chronic social engagement overdrive. They're locked in what Porges calls mobilized ventral vagal state, constantly scanning for social emotional threats, reading micro-expressions obsessively, attunement systems on maximum sensitivity. This isn't conscious choice. It's autonomic nervous system dysregulation that feels like empathic sensitivity, the exhaustion empaths experience after social interaction. That's the physiological cost of chronic hypervigilance. Your nervous system has been in threat detection mode the entire time, even if consciously you felt you were just connecting deeply. Now we come to perhaps the most disturbing research finding, the projection studies. Jung's theory that empaths often experience their own disowned shadow material as intuitive knowing about others has been validated experimentally. Dr. Drew Weston's research on projection and transference showed that individuals with poor self-awareness and weak ego boundaries consistently attributed their own emotional states to others. In laboratory settings, subjects were induced into specific emotional states: anxiety, anger, sadness, without their conscious awareness. Then they were asked to evaluate others' emotional states from photographs or videos. Consistently, subjects with weak self-awareness attributed their own induced emotions to the people they were observing, despite no objective evidence supporting those attributions. They believed they were being empathic, sensing what others felt. They were actually experiencing their own feelings and projecting them outward. This finding demolishes the mystical interpretation of empathic gifts. What feels like clairvoyant intuition is often psychological projection combined with hypervigilance. You're not reading someone's hidden anxiety. You're experiencing your own anxiety and assuming it's theirs. The codependency research ties everything together. Dr. Pia Melody's clinical work defined codependency as a pattern where individuals have permeable or non-existent boundaries, locate their sense of self in others' reactions, and experience others' emotions as their own. This matches precisely what Jung called unconscious identity, and what neuroscience now shows as underdeveloped self-referential processing combined with hyperactive mirror neuron systems. Melody's research showed that codependency originates in childhood emotional neglect or enmeshment, the same developmental origins as empathic dissolution, and she documented the catastrophic consequences: identity confusion, relationship addiction, chronic anxiety, depression, and physical illness. The autoimmune connection is particularly striking. Dr. Gabor Mate's research on the mind-body connection in disease showed that individuals who chronically abandon their own needs, suppress their emotions, and maintain permeable boundaries have significantly higher rates of autoimmune conditions. His theory, the body's immune system mirrors the psyche's boundary problems. When you have no psychological boundaries, when you can't distinguish self from not self at the emotional level, your immune system begins making the same mistake at the biological level, attacking your own tissues because it can't identify what's you and what's other. The studies on empaths with chronic fatigue syndrome fibromyalgia, and multiple sclerosis show this pattern consistently. These aren't random illnesses. They are the body's physical manifestation of psychological boundary dissolution. Dr. Elaine Aron's research on highly sensitive persons attempted to reframe this pattern as a genetic trait rather than trauma adaptation. She argued that approximately 20% of people are born with more sensitive nervous systems, deeper processing of stimuli, stronger emotional reactions, greater empathic capacity, but later research challenged this interpretation. When controlling for childhood adverse experiences, the correlation between high sensitivity and trauma history was overwhelming. The traits Aron described as innate sensitivity matched precisely the symptoms of developmental trauma and insecure attachment. Some people may indeed be born with naturally permeable boundaries or heightened sensitivity, but the empathic dissolution pattern, the inability to maintain a separate self, the compulsive merging, the loss of identity in relationships, this appears to be primarily developmental, not genetic. Jung's concept of psychic infection has been validated in social psychology research on emotional contagion. Dr. Elaine Hatfield's studies showed that emotions spread between people through unconscious mimicry and synchronization. But here's the key finding. Individuals with strong ego boundaries experienced emotional contagion as temporary and conscious. They could feel with someone and then return to their own emotional state. Individuals with weak ego boundaries, the empathically dissolved, experienced emotional contagion as overwhelming and permanent. They absorbed others' emotions and couldn't distinguish them from their own. They became infected, to use Jung's term, and had no immune system to clear the infection. The attachment theory research provides the developmental timeline. Dr. Mary Main's work on attachment patterns showed that children with anxious attachment, usually resulting from inconsistent or anxious caregivers, develop hypervigilance to relationship cues and difficulty with separation. They grow into adults who experience aloneness as existential threat and seek merger to regulate anxiety. This is the attachment basis of empathic dissolution. The infant who couldn't rely on caregiver attunement develops into an adult who becomes hyper-attuned to everyone else as a survival strategy. The child who experienced separation as potential abandonment becomes the adult who can't tolerate psychological boundaries. Dr. Peter Fonagy's research on mentalization, the capacity to understand one's own and others' mental states, showed that securely attached individuals develop strong mentalization for both self and other. They can track their own feelings while understanding others, maintaining clear distinction between the two. But individuals with empathic dissolution patterns show a striking imbalance. Highly developed mentalization for others, severely impaired mentalization for self. They can read your emotional state with uncanny accuracy. They have no idea what they themselves are feeling. This research validates Jung's observation that empaths haven't developed the ego function of self-reflection. They have outer awareness without inner awareness, other knowledge without self-knowledge. Finally, the neuroscience of individuation itself. Dr. Dan Siegel's work on neural integration showed that psychological health requires integration of multiple brain regions, specifically the integration of right hemisphere emotional processing with left hemisphere narrative processing, and the integration of subcortical survival responses with cortical conscious awareness. Empathically dissolved individuals show poor neural integration. Their emotional systems are hyperactive but disconnected from conscious processing. They feel intensely but can't make sense of what they're feeling or distinguish their feelings from others. The individuation process Jung described, becoming conscious of unconscious content, integrating shadow material, developing ego strength, correlates with measurable increases in neural integration. The brain literally reorganizes itself as the psyche individuates. This research transforms empathic dissolution from identity to diagnosis, from gift to disorder, from mystical sensitivity to measurable trauma adaptation, and it provides hope. Because if the pattern is neurologically based, it can be neurologically changed. The brain that wired itself for dissolution can rewire itself for integration. The nervous system that learned hypervigilance can learn regulation. The attachment system that organized around merger can reorganize around secure autonomy, but it requires the one thing empaths most resist: choosing yourself, setting boundaries, building a self, tolerating the terror of separation. The neuroscience proves it's possible. Jung's work shows the path. The question is whether you're willing to walk it. Way 1. Emotional absorption, mistaking psychic infection for intuitive connection. You walk into the office and immediately feel heavy, weighted, like something's wrong, but you can't identify what. Within minutes, you've scanned every coworker's face, analyzed every interaction, and concluded, Tom is anxious about the presentation. Sarah is angry about something. The entire department is tense. By lunchtime, you're exhausted, carrying Tom's anxiety in your chest, Sarah's anger in your jaw, the collective tension in your shoulders. And here's the devastating part. You believe you're being helpful, attuned, empathic. Jung called this participation mystique, the primitive psychological state, where you haven't differentiated your psyche from your environment, where you experience others' emotional states as your own because you've never established the boundary that would let you feel with them while remaining yourself. This isn't intuition, it's infection. The pattern starts in childhood. Your mother's moods were unpredictable, so you learned to sense them constantly. Your father's rage came without warning, so you developed radar for his emotional weather. The emotional atmosphere of your home was so unstable that you became an emotional seismograph, detecting every tremor before it became an earthquake. This saved you then. It's destroying you now, because you never learned that emotions can be felt about without being absorbed into, that you can notice someone is sad without becoming sad yourself, that their anxiety is theirs, not yours to carry. The archetype at work here is the sponge, the figure that absorbs everything and has no container to hold it. In fairy tales, this appears as the servant who takes on everyone's burdens until they collapse. In dreams, it manifests as drowning, being flooded, or having no skin to separate inside from outside. The shadow element no one talks about. Absorption lets you avoid your own emotions. As long as you're processing everyone else's feelings, you never have to face yours. As long as the room's emotional atmosphere fills you completely, you don't have to feel the emptiness that's actually there when you're alone with yourself. There's a payoff. Being the emotional sponge makes you feel special, needed, important. People marvel at your sensitivity. You're the one who just gets it. The person everyone comes to. This provides identity, purpose, significance, but the cost is catastrophic. You spend your entire life carrying emotions that aren't yours, exhausted by social interaction, unable to distinguish your actual feelings from absorbed feelings. You develop chronic fatigue, mysterious aches, emotional volatility that makes no sense until you realize that's not even your sadness. That's your friend's divorce grief that you absorbed 3 days ago and never discharged. The mistake you're making, you believe absorption is connection. That feeling others' emotions as your own means you're loving them deeply, understanding them profoundly. Jung would say you're not connecting with them at all. You're obliterating the boundary that would make genuine connection possible. Real intimacy requires two separate beings. Absorption means there's only one being, a merged, undifferentiated blob of feeling with no one home inside. You think you're being empathic. You're actually preventing empathy by refusing to develop a separate self that could consciously choose to feel with someone rather than unconsciously become them. The real-time recognition signs. After social interaction, you can't identify which feelings are yours. You avoid certain people because their energy drains you, but really, you're absorbing their emotional content and don't know how to filter it. You feel anxious and can't identify why until you realize your partner was anxious and you absorbed it without noticing. You get angry for no reason until you trace it back. Your coworker was suppressing rage and you absorbed it like emotional osmosis. The terror that keeps this operating. If you stop absorbing, you'll lose your connection to others. If you develop boundaries, you'll become cold, shut down, unloving. If you stop feeling everything, you'll feel nothing. But Jung's promise, the only path to real feeling is through boundary development. You can't actually feel your own emotions until you stop absorbing everyone else's. And you can't truly love another person until you're separate enough from them to see them clearly. Way 2. Hypervigilant caretaking, the wounded healer, archetype gone wrong. You sense your partner's need before they speak it. Their coffee cup is empty and your body moves automatically to refill it. They sigh and you're already asking what's wrong, already preparing to fix it, already abandoning whatever you were doing to attend to their unexpressed need. This feels like love. It's not. It's hypervigilant caretaking, the survival mechanism that kept you safe as a child, now masquerading as devotion. Jung understood the wounded healer archetype, the person who transforms their own suffering into capacity to help others heal. This is potentially sacred work, but it becomes pathological when you heal others to avoid healing yourself, when you give endlessly to escape receiving, when you make yourself indispensable through caretaking because you've never felt you were valuable just for existing. The developmental origin is parentification. You were the child who had to manage your parents' emotions, needs, or basic functioning. Maybe your mother was alcoholic and you became her caretaker by age 8. Maybe your father was emotionally fragile and you learned to regulate his moods. Maybe your parents were so overwhelmed that you became the emotional manager for your siblings. You learned, I matter because I'm useful. I'm loved because I'm needed. My value is in my service. This wires into your nervous system. By adulthood, you can't be in relationship without constantly monitoring the other person's state and intervening to manage it. You anticipate needs obsessively. Feel responsible for others' happiness, as if it's your personal failure when they're discontent. Experience chronic exhaustion from emotional labor. You perform without being asked. The archetype is the caretaker, martyr, the figure who sacrifices endlessly and derives secret identity from that sacrifice. In mythology, this is Prometheus chained to the rock, liver eternally devoured for the gift he gave humanity. In dreams, it appears as endless service to an ungrateful master or feeding people who never fill up. The shadow, and this is crucial, is rage. Volcanic, suppressed, never acknowledged rage at never being cared for yourself, at the unfairness of always giving and never receiving, at the people who take and never think to give back. But you can't acknowledge this rage because it would shatter your identity as the caretaker, the selfless one, the person who loves without needing. So you bury it, and it emerges as passive aggression, sudden explosions, or mysterious illnesses that finally force people to care for you. There's also shadow superiority. You're the strong one, the one who has it together, the one others need. This secret grandiosity protects you from facing your own vulnerability, neediness, and longing to be cared for. How it masquerades as love. You believe that anticipating and meeting others' needs before they ask is the highest form of care, that being needed means being loved, that your caretaking demonstrates your depth of devotion. Jung would say, you're not loving them. You're controlling them through indispensability, making yourself so necessary that they can't leave, preventing them from developing their own competence because you need them to need you. Real love sometimes means letting people struggle, fail, and learn. Sometimes means saying, I can't help you with that. Sometimes means choosing your own needs over someone else's comfort. The long-term consequences, complete burnout, autoimmune diseases that force you to stop serving, relationships where you're used constantly because you've trained people that you exist to serve them, attracting narcissists and energy vampires who sense your compulsive caretaking and exploit it ruthlessly. And the deepest consequence, you never discover whether anyone would love you if you weren't useful. You never find out if you're valuable beyond your service. You spend your entire life earning the right to exist through endless giving, and you die having never received true care yourself. The real-time recognition, you're exhausted but can't stop moving because someone might need something. You feel resentful but can't identify why, because you chose to help. You cancel your plans when you sense someone needs you, even when they haven't asked. You feel anxious when you're not being useful to someone. The mistake, believing self-sacrifice is love. Confusing control through service with genuine care. Thinking that making yourself indispensable creates security when it actually creates resentment and stagnation. The terror of stopping. If I don't take care of everyone, who am I? If I'm not needed, am I valuable? If I stop giving, will I be abandoned? Jung's challenge. Discover whether you have value beyond your usefulness. Learn to receive without earning it through service. Risk being loved for who you are, not what you do. And face the grief that you've wasted years trying to earn something, love, that can only be freely given. Way 3. Identity evacuation. Becoming a mirror instead of a person. You're having dinner with a friend who loves sushi. You agree. Sushi sounds perfect. The next night, you're with a friend who prefers Italian. Italian sounds perfect too. Someone asks what kind of music you like, and your answer depends entirely on who's asking. You're not being accommodating. You're not being flexible. You're being no one. Jung called this undeveloped persona, when the social mask becomes the only thing there is, because no authentic personality ever formed behind it. You're a mirror that reflects whoever you're with, adapting so completely to your environment that you've become environmental. This is identity evacuation, the systematic abandonment of authentic selfhood in favor of context-dependent performance. It starts young. Maybe your authentic expressions were dangerous. Your parents punished or rejected your real feelings, preferences, or personality. Maybe your environment was so chaotic that you learned to become whoever was safest in each moment. Maybe you were praised so much for being easy and adaptable that you built your identity around having no identity. By adulthood, you've become a psychological chameleon. You mirror the energy, opinions, preferences, and even speech patterns of whoever you're with. You genuinely can't answer, "What do you want?" because the answer depends on who's asking. You feel like an imposter everywhere because you are one. There's no stable self showing up authentically. The archetype is the shapeshifter or the empty vessel, the figure with no fixed form, able to become anything and therefore being nothing. In mythology, this is Proteus, the sea god, who shifts shapes constantly to avoid capture. In dreams, it appears as having no face, being invisible, or changing appearance in every room. The shadow is darker than most recognize. There's secret contempt for the people you serve, a hidden superiority because you can read them so well, mirror them so perfectly, manipulate them through adaptation. There's the terror of being truly known because if someone saw the void where your self should be, they might recoil in horror. And there's the addiction to being needed that comes from having no internal sense of worth. If you can be whoever others need, you'll always have a place, always be wanted, never be abandoned, how it masquerades as love. You believe that complete adaptation to your partner's preferences shows how much you care, that having no needs of your own makes you the perfect partner. That flexibility is generosity, but Jung saw this as incomplete ego development. You're not adapting from strength, you're shape-shifting from weakness. Real adaptation requires a solid self that chooses when to bend. You have no self to choose from. The catastrophic consequence: you reach 40, 50, 60, and realize you've never lived your own life. Every choice was made based on what someone else wanted, needed, or would approve of. You don't know your own values because you've only held borrowed ones. You don't know your own desires because you've only felt others. You've been an extra in everyone else's story, never the protagonist of your own. The relationships you attract mirror this emptiness. You choose partners who require extensive emotional management because they need someone with no needs. Or you choose strong personalities who will fill your void with their preferences, solving the problem of not knowing what you want by deferring to someone who does. Either way, you're never truly in relationship. You're being used as an extension, a prop, a mirror. And because you have no self to offer, this is the only kind of relationship available to you. Real-time recognition. Someone asks your preference and you feel panic. You notice your personality shifts depending on who you're with. You realize you've been performing a version of yourself that matches whoever you're dating. You can't make decisions without checking what someone else would want. The mistake: believing that having no self makes you more loving when it actually makes love impossible. You can't love someone from authenticity when you have no authenticity to love from. You can only perform love through mirroring, which isn't love at all. It's survival through adaptation. The terror that maintains this: if I stop adapting, people will see there's nothing underneath. If I show my real self, I'll be rejected, except I can't show my real self because I've never developed one. If I stop being whoever others need, I'll be alone, which might be preferable to being surrounded by people who only love the version of you that you're performing. Jung's path forward. The terrifying work of discovering who you are when no one's watching, building preferences from scratch, making choices based on internal guidance rather than external expectation, risking being disliked as yourself rather than loved as a performance, and grieving all the years spent being no one, all the relationships that were never real because you were never real in them, all the experiences you missed because you were too busy becoming whoever was needed. Way 4. Projection as perception, reading your shadow in their face. You know your partner is about to leave you. You can sense it. The way they looked at you this morning, the tone in their voice yesterday, the subtle withdrawal you've been tracking obsessively. You confront them. I know you want to end this. They look at you, confused. I don't know what you're talking about. I was just distracted because of work. But you don't believe them. You know what you felt. You're certain of what you sensed. 3 months later, you end the relationship because you can't tolerate the anxiety of knowing they're going to leave. 2 weeks after that, they tell a mutual friend, I was confused. Everything was fine until they became paranoid that I was leaving. That paranoia is actually what destroyed us. This is projection as perception, Jung's most crucial teaching, the one that dismantles the entire empathic identity. What you think you're sensing in others is often your own unconscious content, disowned and projected outward. You're not reading them, you're reading yourself. The mechanism is elegant and devastating. You have feelings, fears, desires, or qualities that are unacceptable to your conscious mind. Maybe anger. Your family punished anger, so you exiled it. Maybe neediness. You learned to be strong, so vulnerability was banned. Maybe sexuality, ambition, selfishness, rage, desire. These qualities don't disappear. They go into the shadow, the unconscious repository of everything you can't acknowledge as yours. And from the shadow, they operate invisibly, projected onto everyone around you. You perceive in others what you've exiled in yourself. If you've disowned your anger, you'll constantly sense that others are angry with you. If you've banished your neediness, you'll attract needy people who require your caretaking. If you've suppressed your desire to leave relationships, you'll become hypervigilant to signs that others are leaving you. Your empathic knowing is often your shadow speaking. The developmental origin, childhood environments where certain qualities were punished or dangerous. You learn to split off parts of yourself for survival. But those parts didn't die, they went underground, and now they emerge as intuition about what others are feeling. The archetype is the oracle or false prophet, the one who claims to see truth but is actually seeing their own reflection. In mythology, this is Cassandra, cursed to speak truth that no one believes. Except in this version, she's not speaking truth at all, just her own projections. In dreams, this appears as mirrors that distort, seeing threats that aren't there, or being certain about things that turn out to be false. The shadow is grandiosity, believing you see more than others see, that your perceptions are more accurate, your intuition more developed. This secret superiority protects you from examining whether what you're sensing is actually real or just your unconscious material reflected back. There's also the avoidance of inner work. As long as you're focused on reading, analyzing, and managing others' emotional states, you never have to face your own. Your empathic gift becomes the ultimate defense against self-knowledge, how it masquerades as love. You believe that your ability to sense what others are feeling, even when they don't know it themselves, is profound intimacy, that your intuitive knowing is how you care for them, that your empathic perception demonstrates your deep connection. But Jung would say, you're not connecting with them. You're encountering yourself in their face and calling it empathy. You're making them a screen for your shadow and then exhausting yourself trying to heal what's actually your own wound. The devastating consequences. You attract the same type of person repeatedly because you're projecting the same material repeatedly. You're blindsided when people act contrary to your intuition because it was never intuition, it was projection. You exhaust yourself trying to heal or save or fix people who didn't ask for healing and often don't need it. And most tragically, you never do your own shadow work because you're convinced the work is out there, in them, needing your empathic attention. Real-time recognition. You know what someone is feeling, but when you check, they're not feeling that. You attract the same personality type in different bodies. You're constantly trying to heal or fix people who resist your help. You feel certain about someone's emotional state and act on that certainty, only to discover you were wrong. The mistake, calling projection intuition, confusing your unhealed wounds with their emotional state, believing that feeling something strongly means it's true about them, when strong feeling often means it's true about you. The terror underneath. If I'm not actually reading others accurately, then I've wasted years exhausting myself over misperceptions. If my empathic gift is actually projection, then I'm not special or insightful, I'm just unconscious. If I have to take back my projections, I'll have to face all the material I've exiled, and that might destroy me. Jung's solution, the systematic practice of projection withdrawal. Every time you sense something in someone, ask yourself, is this mine? What part of me is this? Every time you're certain you know what someone's feeling, check with them, and when they say something different, believe them over your certainty. The work of shadow integration, recognizing, accepting, and re-owning all the qualities you've exiled, your anger, your neediness, your desire to abandon people, your selfishness, your cruelty, your ambition, your sexuality. When you reclaim your shadow, it stops appearing in everyone around you. When you own your qualities, you stop sensing them in others. When you do your work, you stop trying to heal theirs. And paradoxically, this is when real empathy becomes possible, because now you're seeing them clearly instead of seeing your reflection. Now you're connecting with who they actually are instead of who you need them to be to carry your projections. Way 5. Enmeshment as intimacy, the merger fantasy. You and your partner think as one. You finish each other's sentences. You can't imagine where you end and they begin. When they hurt, you hurt, physically in your body. When they succeed, you succeed. You've become a single unit, a merged entity, and this, you believe, is the deepest love possible. This isn't love, it's psychological fusion, and it's destroying both of you. Jung called this unconscious identity, the failure to separate psychologically, the state where two people merge into one undifferentiated unit and both lose themselves in the process. It feels like the ultimate intimacy. It's actually the prevention of intimacy, because real intimacy requires two separate, individuated beings who can meet each other fully while remaining themselves. What you're experiencing is the opposite. Two incomplete selves collapsing into each other, hoping the merger will fill the void where wholeness should be. The developmental origin is insecure attachment, particularly the anxious style. You didn't experience secure connection with consistent boundaries as a child. Instead, you learned that connection requires merger, that love means obliterating separation, that autonomy means abandonment. The infant naturally experiences merger with mother. This is developmentally appropriate at the beginning. But then separation individuation is supposed to occur. You're supposed to discover, I am not mother, I am me. We are separate, and this separation is safe. For you, this never happened. Separation felt like death. Boundaries felt like rejection. Being your own person felt like losing love. So you remained in the merger state, carrying it into every relationship, seeking partners who would recreate that infantile fusion. The archetype is the lover consumed or the merged infant, the figure who achieves union through obliteration. In mythology, this is Narcissus, drowning in his own reflection, or lovers who die together rather than live apart. In dreams, it manifests as drowning together, becoming one creature, or losing yourself inside another person's body. The shadow is terror, absolute existential terror of being a separate self, because separation means potential abandonment, and abandonment feels like death itself. The merger protects you from ever having to face that terror. As long as you're fused with someone, you never have to experience the vulnerability of being alone. There's also the vampiric quality no one discusses. Merger looks like love, but it's often mutual consumption. You need their life force to feel real. They need yours to feel complete. Both of you are feeding off each other because neither has developed a separate, sustainable self. How it masquerades as love. You believe that thinking as one, feeling as one, being as one is the height of connection, that losing yourself in another person is romantic, devotional, spiritual, that we're so close, we're basically the same person, is relationship goals. But Jung knew, mature love requires differentiation first. Two whole people who don't need each other, choosing to be with each other. Connection that enhances rather than defines identity. Intimacy that includes autonomy rather than requires its sacrifice. The devastating consequences. Both people stop individuating. Growth becomes impossible because change would threaten the merger. You can't pursue your own interests, develop your own opinions, or make your own choices without the other feeling threatened. Conflict becomes unbearable because conflict requires holding separate perspectives, and the merger can't tolerate separation even in disagreement. So either all conflict is suppressed, creating seething resentment, or every conflict becomes existentially threatening, creating constant drama. The relationship becomes suffocating. What felt like blissful connection starts feeling like claustrophobia. But neither person can leave because leaving would mean facing the terror of being a separate self, the very thing the merger was designed to avoid. And ultimately, the merger often ends catastrophically. One person hits their individuation crisis and desperately needs separation. The other experiences this as abandonment and can't survive it. The relationship implodes traumatically because it was never built on two separate people. It was built on two incomplete selves clinging to each other for survival. Real-time recognition. You panic when your partner wants alone time. You can't tolerate them having experiences without you. You feel their emotions in your body and can't distinguish them from yours. You make decisions as we before considering what I want. You interpret any expression of individuality as potential abandonment. You feel incomplete when they're not around. The mistake. Believing merger is intimacy, confusing codependency with cosmic connection, thinking that two people dissolving into each other is love, when real love requires two distinct people who remain whole while connecting deeply. Jung's teaching was radical. You cannot truly love someone you're merged with. You can only love your need for them, your use of them to avoid, your own emptiness, your dependence on them to feel real. Love becomes possible only between two separate, individuated beings. Only when you've become a whole person can you genuinely love another whole person. Until then, you're just two incomplete selves trying to create one whole person through merger, and failing, always failing, because the mathematics don't work. 1/2 plus 1/2 doesn't equal one whole. It equals two halves desperately clinging to each other, terrified that separation will reveal they're both incomplete. The terror that maintains enmeshment. If we separate, even psychologically, I'll die. If they become their own person with their own interests and opinions, they'll discover they don't need me. If I develop a separate self, they'll abandon me. If I can't feel what they feel, I won't know how to love them. But Jung's promise, the only sustainable love is between two people who've survived the terror of separateness and discovered they're still intact. Two people who know they can exist alone and choose not to. Two people who've individuated and then consciously choose connection from wholeness, not need. The work required, consciously bearing the anxiety of separateness, developing your own interests, opinions, and identity, even when it triggers abandonment fears, learning to self-soothe instead of requiring constant merger for regulation, tolerating your partner being different from you, disagreeing with you, having experiences without you. This feels like relationship death. It's actually relationship birth, the first time you're relating to an actual person instead of your projection of them, your need for them, your use of them to complete yourself. Way 6. Narcissist magnetism, the unconscious complementary relationship. You've had 3 significant relationships. All 3 partners were narcissistic. You tell yourself it's bad luck, terrible judgment, or that you're just attracted to broken people you can heal. Jung would say, this is no accident. You and the narcissist are playing out a perfectly choreographed shadow dance. They have what you disown. You have what they lack. Together you create a complete system, and both of you are trapped in it. Here's the pattern. The empath has no self and is willing to disappear completely into another. The narcissist has inflated self and requires constant external supply to maintain that inflation. The empath needs to be needed to feel valuable. The narcissist needs someone who will provide endless attention, admiration, and emotional labor without requiring reciprocity. It's a perfect psychological fit, and it's catastrophically destructive to both. The developmental origins mirror each other perfectly. The narcissist often grew up with a parent who treated them as an extension, requiring them to be special, perfect, or extraordinary to earn love. They developed a grandiose false self to meet that demand while their authentic self went into exile. The empath often grew up with a parent who treated them as an extension too, but in the opposite direction. They were required to be the caretaker, the manager, the one without needs. They developed a self-negating adaptation while their authentic needs went into exile. Both are incomplete. The narcissist over-identified with grandiosity and exiled vulnerability, neediness, and authentic emotion. The empath over-identified with service and exiled assertiveness, anger, and self-care. When they meet, something magnetic happens. The empath encounters someone who seems to need them desperately, which is true. The narcissist needs supply. The narcissist encounters someone willing to provide endless attention without demanding reciprocity, which is true. The empath has been trained not to have needs. The empath thinks, finally, someone who needs what I have to give, someone I can help, someone I can love deeply. The narcissist thinks, finally, an infinite resource, someone who will maintain my grandiosity without requiring I see them as separate. Both are partially right, and both are entering a trauma bond that will nearly destroy the empath while reinforcing the narcissist's pathology. The archetype is the savior-victim dyad, what Jung called anima-animus possession. The empath is possessed by the wounded healer archetype gone toxic, compulsively trying to heal someone who can't be healed because they don't see themselves as wounded. The narcissist is possessed by the inflated king or queen, demanding worship while seeing others only as extensions of themselves. In mythology, this appears as Beauty and the Beast, where one partner believes their love will transform the monster. In fairy tales, it's the princess trying to heal the cursed prince. In dreams, it manifests as trying to save someone who's drowning, but they keep pulling you under, or loving someone who can't see you at all. The shadow for the empath is darker than most realize. There's hidden narcissism in the empathic position. You believe you're special because of your suffering, superior because you love so much, more evolved because you give endlessly while they take. There's also the masochistic pleasure in being needed by someone so demanding. The drama, chaos, and intensity feel like passion. The constant crises feel like depth. The emotional roller coaster feels like real love compared to the boring stability of healthy relationships. And there's avoidance. By focusing obsessively on the narcissist's problems, behaviors, and needs, you never have to face your own lack of self. You can stay in the caretaker role that feels familiar instead of doing the terrifying work of becoming a separate person. How it masquerades as love. You believe you're seeing past their defensive exterior to their wounded inner child, that your loyalty during their cruelty demonstrates your love's purity, that staying despite mistreatment proves your capacity for unconditional love. You tell yourself, they need me. No one else understands them. I can heal them with enough love. If I just try harder, give more, they'll finally change. But Jung understood. This isn't love. It's unconscious complementarity. You're not healing them. You're enabling their pathology while they're destroying yours. You're not loving them. You're using them to avoid facing your own emptiness. The narcissist uses you as supply, a resource to drain for attention and validation. You use them as purpose, a project to fix so you don't have to build your own life. The devastating consequences, years lost to someone who will never see you as fully human. Progressive erosion of your already fragile sense of self. Chronic trauma from the cycle of idealization, devaluation, and discard. Complete depletion, emotionally, physically, spiritually, from trying to fill a bottomless void. And the cruelest consequence, The narcissist often does eventually get better after they leave you and find someone else, because narcissists can grow, but not while they have an inexhaustible supply source willing to absorb all their pathology. You're actually preventing their growth by being so willing to disappear. Real-time recognition. You're constantly walking on eggshells, managing their moods, trying to prevent their rage or withdrawal. You rationalize their cruelty. They're just wounded. I need to be patient. You've lost yourself completely in trying to maintain their stability. Every conversation is about them, their needs, their feelings, their problems. You can't remember the last time they asked how you are and meant it. You feel crazy, constantly questioning your own perceptions because they deny your reality. The mistake, believing you can love someone into wholeness, confusing a trauma bond with a soul connection, thinking that tolerating mistreatment is loyalty when it's actually self-betrayal. The terror underneath: if I leave, they'll fall apart and I'll be responsible. If I stop trying to save them, I'm giving up on love. If I admit this relationship is destroying me, I have to face that I chose it repeatedly, and that means confronting why I'm attracted to people who can't love me. Jung's confrontation. The empath is not the victim. The empath is an unconscious participant in a complementary pathological system. You're not superior or more evolved. You're playing out your own unhealed wounds through the narcissist. The shadow work required: recognizing your own narcissism, the grandiosity hidden in suffering, the superiority in being the good one, the inflation in being irreplaceable. Admitting you're attracted to narcissists because they let you hide. Acknowledging that you're addicted to the intensity, the drama, the mission of saving them, and most painful, accepting that you can't heal anyone else until you heal yourself. That leaving isn't abandonment. It's the most loving thing you can do for both of you. That your loyalty to their potential is actually disloyalty to your own. The path forward requires developing the exact qualities you've exiled: healthy selfishness, assertiveness, boundaries, the capacity to prioritize your needs. It requires becoming boring, stable, clear, all the things that make narcissists uninterested in you. When empaths truly individuate, narcissists stop being attractive. They seem one-dimensional, shallow, exhausting. The intensity that once felt like passion now feels like chaos. The need that once made you feel important now feels like a drain. You become attracted to equals, to people with developed selves who don't need fixing, to relationships characterized by reciprocity, respect, and boring, sustainable stability. This transformation feels like losing your identity, and it is. You're losing the identity built around being the special sufferer, the loyal lover, the one who could handle what no one else could. But you're gaining something infinitely more valuable: yourself. Way 7. Self-betrayal as devotion. The ultimate disappearing act. This is where all the other patterns culminate. The final, most devastating mechanism through which empaths lose themselves while believing they're loving deeply. You ignore every red flag. You rationalize abuse as they're just hurt. You stay in a relationship that's destroying you because leaving would feel like failure. You abandon your values, your boundaries, your reality itself. And you call this love. This is self-betrayal as devotion, the systematic annihilation of your own well-being, safety, and truth in service of maintaining connection with someone who's harming you. Jung understood this as ego capitulation, when the ego, which should be maintaining boundaries and reality testing, completely surrenders to forces that are destructive, when the self-preservation instinct fails entirely, replaced by a compulsion to sacrifice everything at the altar of relationship. The origin is environments where love was conditional on self-erasure, where you learned, to be loved, you must disappear. To be chosen, you must require nothing. To be worthy, you must sacrifice everything. Maybe you watched your mother endure your father's abuse while calling it love. Maybe your family praised self-sacrifice as virtue and punished self-care as selfishness. Maybe you learned that your needs didn't matter, your pain was invisible, your truth was negotiable, and if you accepted this completely enough, you might earn belonging. By adulthood, you've internalized this so deeply that self-betrayal feels like devotion, staying feels like loyalty, accepting the unacceptable feels like commitment, and leaving, even when you're being destroyed, feels like the ultimate moral failure. The archetype is the martyr or the self-sacrificer, the figure who finds meaning through suffering. In religious mythology, this is the saint who achieves holiness through persecution. In fairy tales, it's the stepchild who endures endless cruelty and is finally rewarded. In dreams, it appears as being crucified, burned alive, or slowly disappearing while everyone watches. The shadow is complex and dark. There's the payoff of victimhood, the moral superiority of being the one who suffered most, loved most purely, sacrificed most completely. There's a perverse pride in tolerating what others couldn't tolerate. There's the identity constructed entirely around suffering. I'm the person who stays, who endures, who loves no matter what. There's also the avoidance of authentic power. If you're the victim, you're never responsible. If you're the martyr, you never have to take charge of your life. If you're the one sacrificing, you never have to face your own agency. The terrifying truth that you're choosing this repeatedly, and you could choose differently. And there's the fear of ordinariness. If you leave the dramatic, painful relationship, you'll have to face normal life. Build a regular, stable existence. Be an ordinary person with an ordinary life. The martyrdom makes you special. What would you be without it? How it masquerades as love. You believe that real love means accepting someone completely, including their worst behaviors. That commitment means never giving up, even when continuing means your destruction. That leaving someone who's suffering, even when they're causing your suffering, is abandonment. You tell yourself they can't help it, they're doing their best. Everyone has flaws. I'm not perfect either. Real love is unconditional. If I love them enough, they'll change. The hard times make the good times more meaningful. These are the mantras of self-betrayal dressed as devotion. Jung would ask, where are you in this equation? When does your suffering matter? At what point does self-preservation become not selfishness, but sanity? The catastrophic consequences. You develop serious health problems as your body rebels against the constant betrayal. Autoimmune disease, chronic pain, mysterious symptoms that doctors can't explain. All manifestations of a self attacking itself because you won't protect it. You lose years, sometimes decades, to someone who will never love you the way you need, because they're incapable of it. You model for your children, if you have them, that love means self-destruction, creating generational trauma. You reach a point where you can't remember who you were before the relationship. Your entire identity is constructed around enduring, adapting, sacrificing. If you left, you genuinely wouldn't know who you are or how to function. And finally, you die having never lived, never pursued your dreams, developed your gifts, explored your potential. Your entire existence was consumed by someone else's drama, needs, or pathology, while you told yourself this was love. Real-time recognition. You regularly accept treatment that would make you furious if you saw a friend tolerating it. You make excuses for behavior that's objectively harmful. You've normalized things that should never be normal. Screaming, manipulation, cruelty, control. Your body is rebelling with illness or exhaustion. You daydream about being in an accident so you'd have a socially acceptable reason to rest or leave. You've become someone you don't recognize. Your values are negotiable. Your boundaries are suggestions. Your needs are irrelevant. And you've convinced yourself this is what commitment looks like. The mistake: believing self-destruction is love. Confusing loyalty to someone else with betrayal of yourself. Thinking that endurance is virtue when sometimes leaving is the most loving act for both people. The terror that maintains this: if I leave, I'm a quitter, a failure, someone who gives up when things get hard. If I prioritize myself, I'm selfish. If I admit this relationship is destroying me, I have to face that I've wasted years, and that's unbearable. If I walk away, I lose my identity as the one who stayed. Jung's most confrontational teaching: you are betraying yourself more catastrophically than anyone else could betray you. You are the one choosing to stay. You are the one rationalizing harm. You are the one abandoning your own soul while claiming this is devotion. And the person you're loving through this self-betrayal, you're not loving them at all. You're enabling their worst qualities, preventing their growth by absorbing all consequences of their behavior, denying them the opportunity to face reality and change. Your self-betrayal serves no one, not you, not them, not your children if you have them, not the world which needs you whole, not martyred. The path forward requires something most people can't access: holy selfishness, the sacred act of choosing yourself even when it feels like the most selfish thing imaginable. The radical prioritization of your own well-being over someone else's comfort. It requires leaving, not in anger or revenge, but in clarity. Not to punish them, but to save yourself. Not because they're a monster, but because you've finally recognized you matter too. The work involves grieving the years lost, the person you might have been if you hadn't betrayed yourself so completely, the love you thought you had but never actually did. It means building a self from scratch, discovering what you value when you're not adjusting to someone else's values, learning what you want when you're not managing someone else's wants, finding out who you are when you're not being whoever keeps the peace. And it means facing the ultimate truth. You were never loving them deeply. You were avoiding loving yourself at all, because real self-love would never tolerate what you've tolerated. Genuine self-respect would never rationalize what you've rationalized. Authentic self-worth would never endure what you've endured. The moment you truly love yourself, everything changes. The unacceptable becomes obviously unacceptable. The exits become visible. The choice becomes clear, and you walk away. Not because you're giving up on love, but because you finally discovered what love actually is, and this wasn't it. The empathic dissolution pattern isn't just uncomfortable, it's not just exhausting or unfulfilling. Left unconscious, it leads to specific catastrophic outcomes that Jung documented throughout his clinical work. These aren't theoretical dangers. They're predictable endpoints when the pattern continues without intervention. Each one represents a deeper level of dissolution, a more complete loss of self, a more devastating consequence of mistaking merger for love. Danger 1. Complete identity dissolution, the disappearance into nothing. There's a point of no return in identity loss, a threshold where the self that never fully formed becomes so fragmented that recovery may not be possible. Jung saw this in patients who had spent decades merged with others, usually in long marriages characterized by complete self-abnegation. By the time they came for help, there was almost nothing left to work with. No core identity to excavate, no authentic preferences to uncover, just a void that had learned to approximate personhood by reflecting whoever was nearby. The psychological term is depersonalization disorder, the chronic sense that you're not real, that you're watching yourself from outside, that there's no you actually present in your own life. But for empaths in dissolution, it's not a disorder to be treated. It's the logical outcome of never developing a self in the first place. Clinical presentations Jung documented, a 60-year-old woman who came to therapy after her husband's death and realized she had no idea who she was. Every decision she'd ever made had been based on his preferences, his needs, his opinions. Alone for the first time, she experienced complete psychological collapse. She couldn't decide what to eat, where to live, how to spend her time. Not because she was depressed, she was literally unable to access any internal guidance because none had ever developed. A 45-year-old man who left a 20-year codependent relationship and found himself unable to function. He'd spent 2 decades being whoever his partner needed. Without that role, he experienced dissociative episodes, couldn't maintain employment, lost connection to any sense of continuous identity across time. These aren't people recovering from difficult relationships. These are people discovering they never existed as separate beings. And at a certain point, the neuroplasticity window may close. The brain has organized itself so completely around merger that independent functioning becomes nearly impossible. The medical manifestation. Some of these patients develop dementia-like symptoms decades before age would predict. Memory becomes unreliable because there was no consistent self-having experiences to remember. Executive function fails because there was never a developed ego making decisions from internal guidance. This is the first catastrophic danger. You can disappear so completely that you can't be recovered. The self that should have formed never did, and the window for forming it closes. Danger 2. Autoimmune catastrophe, when the body attacks the missing self. The correlation between empathic dissolution and autoimmune disease isn't coincidental, it's causative. Your immune system's primary function is distinguishing self from not self, identifying what belongs to your body and what's foreign. When that system works correctly, it destroys invaders while leaving your own cells intact. But what happens when psychological boundaries are so permeable that there's no clear self at the psychological level? The immune system mirrors the confusion. Dr. Gabor Mate's research documented this pattern extensively. Patients with lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, overwhelming numbers of them shared a psychological profile. Chronically poor boundaries, inability to say no, compulsive caretaking, and deep-seated belief that their needs don't matter. Their bodies were physically manifesting what was psychologically true. They couldn't distinguish self from other. Their immune systems attacked their own tissues because at a deep level they'd never established what was theirs to protect. Jung understood psychosomatic illness as the body's expression of psychological truth. When the psyche can't consciously acknowledge something, the body speaks it through symptoms. For empaths in dissolution, the message is clear. You're attacking yourself. You've betrayed yourself so systematically that your own defense systems have turned against you. Clinical pattern. A 38-year-old woman developed severe rheumatoid arthritis after years in a codependent marriage. Traditional treatment helped minimally. When she began individuation work, setting boundaries, developing separate identity, learning to prioritize her needs, her inflammation markers improved dramatically. When she finally left the relationship, her symptoms went into remission for the first time in years. Her rheumatologist was baffled. Jung would have understood completely. Her body stopped attacking itself when she stopped attacking herself psychologically. The catastrophic trajectory. Empaths who never address the dissolution pattern often develop progressively severe autoimmune conditions. The body's confusion escalates. More systems become involved. Eventually, the physical damage may become irreversible even if the psychological pattern changes. You can die from empathic dissolution, not metaphorically, literally. Your body gives up trying to maintain boundaries you refuse to maintain psychologically. Danger 3. Becoming the vampire. When empaths flip into narcissism, here's what no one discusses. Long-term empathic dissolution doesn't just drain you. It can transform you into the very thing you've been attracting. The empath to narcissist pipeline is real, and Jung documented it repeatedly. After years, sometimes decades of complete self-abnegation, something inside snaps. The suppressed rage becomes toxic resentment. The hidden superiority, I'm more loving, more evolved, inflates into grandiosity. The exhaustion from endless giving transforms into entitled taking. You become the emotional vampire you've been hosting. The psychological mechanism. You've spent years in a one-down position, telling yourself you're spiritually superior precisely because you sacrifice so much. This creates shadow narcissism, hidden grandiosity built on suffering. When that shadow finally erupts into consciousness, it doesn't emerge integrated. It emerges inflated, rageful, and hungry. Suddenly, you're the one demanding constant attention, requiring extensive emotional management, unable to tolerate others' boundaries, enraged when people won't sacrifice for you the way you sacrificed for them. Clinical pattern. A 50-year-old woman spent 30 years as the family martyr, perfect wife, devoted mother, endless caretaker. Then her children left home and her husband retired. The role that had defined her evaporated. Within months, she became unrecognizable, demanding, critical, impossible to please. She required constant validation from her adult children, raged when they couldn't meet her needs, emotionally manipulated through guilt and threats. She had become, almost overnight, the narcissistic mother she'd spent her life determined not to be. Jung would understand. The persona had shattered. The shadow, full of decades of suppressed rage, unmet needs, and secret grandiosity, had erupted. Without ego strength to integrate it, it possessed her completely. This is one of empathic dissolution's cruelest outcomes. You can become your own perpetrator. The codependent becomes the narcissist. The empath becomes the vampire. The self-sacrificer becomes the entitled demander. And because you have no self-awareness, you never develop that capacity. You can't see it happening. You experience yourself as finally asking for what you need. Everyone else experiences you as monstrously selfish. The generational tragedy. These empaths turned narcissists often have empath children. They've recreated the exact dynamic that wounded them, but now they're playing the narcissist role. The pattern perpetuates across generations, each person unconsciously creating what they consciously tried to avoid. Danger 4. Relationship addiction, the inability to exist alone. Empaths in dissolution don't just prefer relationships. They become unable to exist without them. This is different from loneliness or desire for companionship. This is physiological dependence on merger for psychological survival, like a drug addiction, but the drug is other people's emotional content filling your void. Jung called this loss of ego strength, when the ego becomes so weak that it can't maintain consciousness without constant external input. The patient literally cannot be alone, because aloneness reveals there's no one there. Clinical manifestation, empaths who leave one relationship and are in another within weeks, not because they met someone wonderful, but because the void without merger is unendurable. They experience being single as existential crisis. Or empaths who stay in horrifically destructive relationships because even abusive connection feels safer than the terror of separateness. They'd rather be slowly destroyed by merger than face the annihilation they believe comes with aloneness. The addiction cycle is textbook, the high of new merger, relief from emptiness, sense of purpose, identity through the other. The tolerance, needing more and more merger to feel okay. The withdrawal, panic, despair, physical symptoms when alone. The relapse, jumping into the next relationship despite knowing it's probably unhealthy. Brain scans of relationship-addicted individuals show activation patterns similar to drug addiction. The reward centers light up for merger. The pain centers activate for aloneness. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for decision-making and impulse control, shows reduced activity. They're literally addicted. And like any addiction, it requires progressively higher doses. Each relationship must be more consuming, more intense, more all-encompassing to provide the same relief. Jung saw the endpoint. Patients who physically could not, spend a single evening alone. Who would choose anyone? Abusive partners, inappropriate people, those who were clearly using them, over the unbearable emptiness of their own company. The catastrophic consequence: you spend your entire life running from relationship to relationship, never discovering who you are, never building genuine selfhood, never experiencing the terrifying freedom of being alone and intact. And you die having never met yourself, having spent 80 years fleeing from the encounter that would have set you free. Danger 5: spiritual bypassing into psychosis, when empath identity prevents treatment. The final danger is perhaps most insidious because it disguises itself as spiritual evolution. The empath identity: I'm highly sensitive, I pick up others' energies, I'm cosmically attuned, can become a defense against recognizing serious psychological pathology. What might be treatable conditions get reframed as spiritual gifts, preventing intervention until crisis becomes catastrophe. Jung was vigilant about this. He understood that spiritual language could be used to avoid psychological work, that cosmic interpretations could rationalize psychotic symptoms, that mystical identity could prevent someone from getting the psychiatric help they desperately needed. Clinical cases: a 32-year-old woman experiencing auditory hallucinations, hearing others' thoughts, feeling possessed by external entities, interpreted this as advanced empathic abilities. She joined communities that validated this interpretation, avoided psychiatric evaluation, and progressively lost touch with consensus reality. By the time her family forced intervention, she'd developed full psychotic disorder. Treatment was complicated by years of reinforcement that her symptoms were spiritual gifts, not illness. She'd built entire identity and community around being psychically open, making recovery require dismantling her entire social world. A 45-year-old man whose boundary dissolution became so severe he couldn't distinguish his own thoughts from what he believed he was picking up from collective consciousness. He quit his job to serve as a channel, lost housing because he couldn't focus on mundane survival while feeling everyone's pain. This wasn't spiritual awakening. This was ego dissolution leading to psychosis. But the spiritual framework prevented him from recognizing he was becoming mentally ill. Jung's warning: the psyche can break, consciousness can fragment, the ego can dissolve so completely that you lose contact with reality. And if you're calling this spiritual opening instead of psychological crisis, you won't get help until permanent damage has occurred. The empathic identity becomes dangerous when it rationalizes hearing voices as channeling, interprets paranoia as sensing others' intentions, reframes thought disorder as receiving cosmic information, explains dissociation as existing in multiple dimensions, justifies complete dysfunction as too sensitive for the material world. Some people are genuinely having mystical experiences, others are having psychotic breaks. The difference matters enormously for treatment, but the empath identity can make it impossible to distinguish. The catastrophic outcome: complete break with reality, often irreversible. Chronic psychotic disorder that might have been treatable if caught early. Permanent cognitive damage from extended, untreated psychosis. Jung encountered patients who had spent years in spiritual communities, being told their increasing instability was Kundalini awakening or dark night of the soul when it was actually schizophrenia. By the time they received psychiatric care, the window for optimal intervention had passed. These 5 dangers aren't inevitable, but they're predictable when empathic dissolution continues unconsciously. Each one represents a different form of catastrophe: psychological, physical, relational, existential. The question isn't whether these dangers are real. The clinical evidence is overwhelming. The question is whether you'll recognize your trajectory before you reach the point of no return. Because there is a point of no return, a threshold where recovery becomes impossible, where the dissolution is so complete that rebuilding a self can't happen. Jung's mercy. Most people have time. Most can still choose individuation before catastrophe. Most can still build boundaries, develop selfhood, transform from merged to sovereign, but only if they recognize the pattern. Only if they admit the danger. Only if they're willing to do the work before it's too late. The next section shows how. Jung didn't just identify the problem, he provided the solution, though it's a solution most people won't choose because it requires the one thing empaths have spent their lives avoiding: becoming a separate self. The process he called individuation, the development of psychological wholeness through conscious integration of unconscious content. For empaths, this means something specific: building the ego structure that never formed, establishing boundaries that never developed, and transforming from participation mystique to conscious relationship. This isn't about becoming cold or shut down. It's about developing a strong, boundaried self that can choose connection rather than compulsively merge. It's about transforming from unconscious dissolution to conscious empathy. Jung's blueprint has 6 specific steps, each one building on the last. This isn't quick work. Complete individuation typically requires years, but the alternative, continuing in dissolution until one of the catastrophic outcomes manifests, is far worse. Step 1. Shadow integration of the rejected self. The work begins where it must, reclaiming everything you've exiled to become acceptable. For empaths, this primarily means reclaiming qualities your family, culture, or early relational environment taught you were unacceptable. Anger, selfishness, desire, ambition, sexual hunger, the capacity to say no, the willingness to disappoint others, rage at being used, fury at never being cared for. These qualities didn't disappear when you exiled them. They went into the shadow, the unconscious repository of everything you can't acknowledge as yours. From there, they've been operating invisibly, often projected onto others and then empathically sensed. Jung's method for shadow work: identify what you most judge in others. That's often your shadow. Notice what you're certain you're not. That's usually your shadow. Track your strong reactions, attractions, and repulsions. Both point to shadow material. Explore your dreams for figures representing exiled parts: the angry one, the selfish one, the sexual one. The process requires dialoguing with these shadow figures. Jung's active imagination technique. Close your eyes and invite the figure you've been rejecting, the part of you that's angry, selfish, or wants to leave. Let it speak. Listen without defending. Ask what it needs, what it's protecting, why it's been trying to get your attention. Most empaths discover something shocking. Their shadow qualities aren't evil or destructive. They're protective. The anger was trying to establish boundaries. The selfishness was trying to ensure survival. The desire to leave was trying to save your life. Integration doesn't mean acting on every shadow impulse. It means acknowledging these qualities as yours, understanding their purpose, and consciously choosing when to express them appropriately. For Sarah, from our case study, this meant befriending her rage. For years, she'd been the understanding one, never angry, always compassionate. In therapy, she discovered volcanic fury at her mother for using her, at Mark for requiring her management, at herself for decades of self-betrayal. The integration work involved letting that rage speak, understanding its message. You matter, you have needs, this is unacceptable. And then learning to express boundaries cleanly, rather than either suppressing the anger or exploding destructively. Shadow work is destabilizing. Your identity has been built on not being angry, selfish, or desiring. When you reclaim these qualities, you don't know who you are anymore. This disorientation is necessary. The false self built on rejection must collapse before the authentic self can emerge. Step 2. Withdrawal of projections, taking back what you've placed in others. Once you've begun shadow integration, the next step is systematic projection withdrawal. The painstaking work of recognizing what you see in others is actually your own disowned material. This is harder than it sounds because projections feel absolutely real. You're certain you're sensing what others feel. Jung's challenge, how do you know? The practice. Every time you sense something in someone, ask yourself these questions. Could this be mine? Is this quality or emotion one I've exiled? Am I certain this is their experience, or am I assuming based on my own state? If I asked them directly, would they confirm what I'm sensing? What would it mean about me if this were my projection rather than my perception? Then, and this is crucial, check with the person. I'm sensing you're angry. Is that true? When they say no, believe them over your certainty. Notice the discomfort this creates. That discomfort is your ego resisting the withdrawal of projection. Jung emphasized that projections serve important defensive functions. They let you see in others what you can't face in yourself. Withdrawing them means confronting what you've been avoiding. For empaths, the most common projections, sensing others need you when you're the one who needs connection. Perceiving others are about to abandon you when you want to leave. Detecting others' anxiety when you're anxious. Feeling others' neediness when you're needy, but can't admit it. Intuiting others are judging you when you're judging yourself. The withdrawal practice requires daily vigilance. Keep a journal with 3 columns. What I sensed in them, what they actually reported, what might be mine. Over weeks and months, patterns emerge. You discover you consistently project your own abandonment fears, or your rage, or your neediness. These recurring projections point to core shadow material requiring integration. Sarah discovered she'd spent 15 years projecting her desire to leave onto Mark. She was constantly sensing he wanted to end the relationship, that he was pulling away, that he was going to abandon her. When she finally checked, he'd never considered leaving. He was confused by her constant accusations. The truth, Sarah wanted to leave but couldn't admit it. So she projected that desire onto him and then experienced terror that he'd do what she actually wanted to do herself. Taking back that projection was devastating. It meant admitting she'd wasted years in unnecessary anxiety. It meant acknowledging her own desire to leave, which triggered massive guilt. But it also freed her. Once she owned her projection, she could make a conscious choice, instead of staying out of fear of something that wasn't real. Projection withdrawal transforms relationships. People become clearer, more distinct. You see them as they actually are instead of as carriers for your unconscious content. This can be disappointing. They're often less interesting or complex than your projections made them. But it's also liberating. You're relating to reality, not fantasy. Step 3. Ego-strengthening practices, building the psychological boundaries. Shadow integration and projection withdrawal prepare the ground, but empaths need something more fundamental, ego-strengthening, building the psychological structure that should have formed in childhood but didn't. Jung was clear, ego strength is not ego inflation. A strong ego maintains boundaries, reality tests consistently, and can tolerate anxiety without collapsing into merger. An inflated ego is grandiose, defensive, and brittle. Empaths typically have weak egos, permeable boundaries, poor reality testing, inability to tolerate separateness. The strengthening work is foundational. Practice 1. The daily boundary meditation. Each morning, 15 minutes of active imagination, specifically focused on boundary establishment. Visualize yourself as a solid, contained being. See your body's edge clearly defined. Notice the space that is you and the space that is not you. Practice the internal statement, "This is me, that is not me. I can feel toward you without becoming you." Breathe into your own center. Feel your own aliveness separate from everyone else's. Practice tolerating the sensation of being a distinct entity. Notice when anxiety arises, that's your system resisting separation, and breathe through it without collapsing the boundary. Practice 2. Emotional differentiation training. Throughout the day, practice distinguishing between their emotion, my reaction to their emotion. For example, they are sad, their emotion. I feel tender toward their sadness, my emotion. I want to fix it, my reaction. This three-part distinction prevents absorption while allowing genuine empathy. Practice 3. The sovereign self. Active imagination, Jung's technique adapted specifically for empaths. In meditation or before sleep, invite an image of your individuated self. Not who you are now, but who you'd be fully boundaried, integrated, and whole. Dialogue with this figure. Ask it questions. What does it feel like to have intact boundaries? How does it relate to others without merging? What does it prioritize? How does it handle others' disappointment? Let this figure teach you. Over time, it becomes an internal resource, a blueprint for the self you're building. Practice 4. Graduated boundary setting. Start small. Say no to one minor request this week. Don't explain, justify, or apologize. Just, "No, that doesn't work for me." Tolerate the other person's reaction without managing it. This is excruciating for empaths. Your nervous system will scream that you're causing harm. Sit with it. Breathe. Remind yourself their disappointment is theirs to manage, not yours to fix. Next week, slightly bigger boundary. Work up gradually to saying no to major requests, disappointing people who matter, choosing yourself when it conflicts with others' preferences. Practice 5. Solitude tolerance building empaths. Avoid aloneness because it reveals the void. But individuation requires facing that void and building something real there. Start with 30 minutes alone daily with no distraction, no phone, no music, no input, just you and yourself. Notice what arises, the anxiety, the emptiness, the urge to reach for connection. Don't fill it, sit with it, let it be. Over time, you'll notice something emerging in that space, your actual self, slowly forming. Jung emphasized that ego strength comes through repeated practice of staying separate under pressure. Each time you maintain a boundary despite someone's disappointment, your ego strengthens. Each time you identify your own emotion distinct from others, your self solidifies. Step 4. The differentiation crisis, bearing the terror of separateness. At some point in the individuation process, usually months in, you hit the differentiation crisis, the moment when becoming a separate self stops being theoretical and becomes terrifyingly real. This manifests as overwhelming anxiety, panic attacks, existential dread, or primitive terror that feels like death itself. Jung understood this. You're not just anxious. You're experiencing the psyche's resistance to a fundamental shift from merger to separation. For empaths, this crisis often triggers when you set a major boundary and someone important reacts badly. You spend extended time alone and confront your own emptiness. You realize a relationship only works through your dissolution. You face choosing yourself knowing it will disappoint someone. The crisis feels like, if I do this, I'll die. If I stay separate, I'll be abandoned. If I'm not needed, I have no value. If I choose myself, I'm destroying everything. Jung's guidance. This terror is developmental. You're experiencing what should have happened in childhood, the anxiety of separation individuation. You're feeling it now as an adult, and it's overwhelming because your nervous system is calibrated for merger equals survival. The work is to consciously bear it without collapsing back into merger for relief. This is where most people fail. The terror becomes unendurable, and they return to the familiar suffering of dissolution because it feels safer than the unknown terror of being separate. How to navigate the crisis. Somatic practices. The terror lives in your body. Work with it somatically. Feel where it lodges, chest, throat, stomach. Breathe into it. Let it move through you. Don't try to make it go away. That's another form of avoidance. Feel it completely while maintaining your boundary. Reality testing. Your nervous system is screaming that separation equals death. Reality test this. Have you actually died from setting boundaries? Have people actually abandoned you permanently for having needs? Distinguish between felt sense terror and actual danger. Therapeutic support. Don't do this alone. Find a therapist trained in depth psychology who understands individuation, someone who won't try to make you comfortable, but will hold space for you to transform. Community. Connect with others doing this work, not to merge with them, but to know you're not alone in the terror. This normalization helps tremendously. Sarah's differentiation crisis came when she moved out. Every cell screamed she was destroying Mark, abandoning him, proving she was selfish and unloving. She had panic attacks daily, couldn't eat, experienced physical sensations of dying. Her therapist didn't try to make it stop. Instead, this is the terror you would have felt at age 2 when you first individuated from your mother, but you weren't allowed to feel then. Feel it now. Survive it now. Discover that separation doesn't equal death. Sarah stayed separate despite the terror, and after weeks of acute crisis, something shifted. The terror began subsiding. She noticed, I'm alone, I'm separate, and I'm alive. The catastrophe her nervous system predicted didn't happen. This is Jung's promise. The terror feels unbearable, but it's survivable. And on the other side of surviving it, you discover you're real. You exist. You can be separate and still be okay. Step 5. Animus integration. Completing yourself. For Jung, complete individuation required integrating the contra-sexual archetype, the anima, inner feminine, for men, the animus, inner masculine, for women. This isn't about gender stereotypes, but about psychological wholeness. Empaths in dissolution typically have overdeveloped feminine qualities, receptivity, attunement, nurturing, and underdeveloped masculine qualities, assertion, boundary setting, autonomous action, or vice versa. Some empaths are overly masculine in their caretaking, trying to rescue and fix without receptive feminine capacity. The integration work means developing what you've exiled. For women empaths, the majority, developing inner masculine capacity, assertiveness, clear boundaries, decisive action, healthy aggression, autonomous striving. This doesn't mean becoming masculine in presentation. It means developing these psychological functions so you're not dependent on men to provide them. For men empaths, developing inner feminine capacity, receptivity, emotional fluency, intuitive knowing, nurturing without fixing. Again, not about external presentation, but internal function. Jung's method, active imagination with your animus figure. In meditation, invite this inner figure. For women, often experienced as a strong masculine presence. For men, as feminine wisdom figure. Dialogue with them. What do you offer me that I lack? How would my life change if I integrated you? What are you protecting me from by remaining unconscious? How can I embody your qualities consciously? Sarah's animus appeared in her dreams as a warrior figure, fierce, boundaried, decisive. Through active imagination work, she learned to embody these qualities, not by becoming aggressive, but by accessing her own capacity for clear nose, protective boundaries, and autonomous choice. This integration meant she no longer needed to find these qualities in a partner. She could provide them for herself. This completely changed her relationship patterns. She stopped seeking strong men to provide structure and boundaries because she'd developed her own. The paradox: integrating the contrasexual archetype makes you more psychologically complete, which makes healthy relationship more possible. You're not seeking completion through another person. You're already complete, choosing relationship from wholeness rather than need. Step 6. From participation, mystique, to conscious relationship. The final step is learning to relate to others as separate beings with compassion rather than fusion with codependency. This is where the transformed empath emerges, someone who can feel deeply without losing themselves, who can be present with another's pain without taking it on, who can love without merging. Jung called this conscious relationship, relating with clear awareness of self and other as distinct entities. It requires all the previous work: integrated shadow, withdrawn projections, strong ego, survived differentiation crisis, integrated contrasexual archetype, the practice of conscious relationship, empathy without absorption, feel with them, not as them. Practice: I see your pain and feel compassion, but this is your pain to feel, not mine to carry. Boundaries without walls. Stay open-hearted while maintaining clear limits. I care about you and I can't help you with this right now. Presence without fixing. Witness their experience without trying to change it. Tolerate their discomfort without rescuing them from it. Separate but connected. Two whole people choosing intimacy, not two halves trying to become one. This kind of relating feels completely different from what empaths are used to. It's less intense, less dramatic, less consuming, and infinitely more sustainable. The relationships empaths in individuation create are characterized by reciprocity, both give and receive, respect for boundaries, both honor limits, reality-based connection, seeing each other clearly, not projections, mutual growth, both committed to individuation, sustainable intimacy, closeness that energizes rather than depletes, Jung's ultimate teaching about relationship. Real love only becomes possible between two individuated people who don't need each other but choose each other. Everything before that is need, dependency, projection, or merger, masquerading as love. The individuation blueprint isn't easy. Most people start it and quit within weeks because the discomfort is too great. Most prefer the familiar suffering of dissolution to the unfamiliar terror of becoming separate. But for those who complete it, who do the shadow work, withdraw projections, build ego strength, survive the differentiation crisis, integrate their contrasexual side, and learn conscious relating, the transformation is absolute. You go from having no self to having a self, from unconscious merger to conscious choice, from empathic dissolution to genuine empathy. You become finally a real person, capable of real love, living a real life, and you discover what Jung promised. Individuation doesn't make you less loving, it makes love possible for the first time. Throughout history, empathic individuals have faced the same choice: individuate or dissolve. Some chose dissolution, consciously or unconsciously, and the pattern consumed them. Others chose the terrifying work of building boundaries and became integrated, powerful presences in the world. These contrasts aren't meant to judge those who couldn't individuate. They're meant to show the stakes clearly, to demonstrate what happens when empathic sensitivity remains trapped in participation mystique versus when it's transformed through conscious boundary development. The failures. When empathic gift becomes catastrophe. Sylvia Plath, brilliance without boundaries. Sylvia Plath possessed extraordinary empathic capacity. Her poetry reveals someone who felt everything with overwhelming intensity, her own emotions and everyone else's bleeding together in her psyche. She described herself as having no skin, a perfect metaphor for empathic dissolution. Every emotional stimulus penetrated completely. She absorbed her mother's anxiety, her father's absence, even after death, and most catastrophically, Ted Hughes's emotional landscape. In her journals, Plath documented the pattern: complete merger with Hughes, identity evacuation to become his ideal, hyper-vigilant monitoring of his emotional states, and progressive loss of self. She wrote, "I am his wife. That is all I am." This wasn't poetic expression. It was literal truth about her psychological state. Her empathic permeability meant she experienced his betrayals, his affair, his emotional withdrawal as violence against her very existence. Because she had no separate self to retreat into, his choices destroyed her psychologically. Jung would have recognized this immediately. Plath never developed ego boundaries strong enough to maintain separate identity under relational pressure. Her sensitivity, instead of being channeled through strong ego structure, overwhelmed her completely. The tragedy: her artistic gift required her permeable sensitivity. Her poetry's power came from her capacity to feel so intensely, but without ego strength to contain and channel that sensitivity, it consumed her. She died by suicide at 30, having produced brilliant work but never having individuated into a separate, whole person who could survive relationship dissolution. Princess Diana, empathy as public performance, void as private reality. Diana Spencer exhibited classic empathic dissolution from childhood. Parentified by her mother's departure, she became the family's emotional manager. Her value came from sensing and meeting others' needs. Her empathic gift made her extraordinary in public. She genuinely felt others' suffering and responded with authentic compassion. But privately, she had no self. She shapeshifted for each person, desperate to be loved because she'd never developed internal sense of worth. The bulimia was telling. An eating disorder of boundaries, unable to keep things in or out, consuming and purging, the body enacting what the psyche experienced. She couldn't hold boundaries with food, just as she couldn't hold psychological boundaries with people. Her relationships followed predictable empath patterns, choosing men who needed management, Charles's emotional unavailability, merger attempts that left her depleted, and the constant terror of abandonment, because her identity was entirely dependent on being needed. The media circus made everything worse. She became the world's empath, absorbing collective projections, mother, saint, victim. She had no strong ego to resist these projections, so she became whatever was projected onto her while losing herself completely. Despite therapy and attempts at recovery, Diana never achieved individuation. She died at 36 in a relationship that had all the hallmarks of another merger attempt. Intensity without boundaries, drama without substance. Jung would say, she was loved by millions but never became a self. She felt everyone's pain but never learned to identify her own separate from what she absorbed. She was the people's princess and nobody at all. Marilyn Monroe, the ultimate disappearance. If empathic dissolution could be embodied, it was Marilyn Monroe. She existed entirely as what others needed her to be, the studio's sex symbol, the director's muse, the playwright's fantasy, the president's secret. She described the pattern herself. "I've never really been myself. I'm always being someone else for someone else. This wasn't Hollywood cynicism. This was accurate self-diagnosis of identity evacuation. Her empathic capacity made her an extraordinary actress. She could sense what the camera, the director, the audience needed, and become that completely. But she couldn't become herself because no self had formed. The chronic lateness, the addictions, the relationship disasters, all symptoms of having no internal structure. Without ego strength, she couldn't manage time, regulate substances, or choose relationships consciously. She was purely reactive, absorbing and responding to external demands, with nothing internal to anchor her. Men experienced her as infinitely adaptable, perfectly attuned, magically responsive. Because she was, there was no gooding ziwo to maintain separate preferences. She became whoever they needed. The tragedy intensified. The more people wanted her, the more she disappeared. The more she was desired, the less she existed. Fame made the dissolution complete. She died at 36 of probable suicide, though whether intentional or accidental hardly matters. Someone with no self can't maintain the boundaries necessary for survival. The dissolution was fatal. The successes, when empaths choose individuation. Carl Jung, from near-psychosis to integrated healer. Jung's own journey through empathic dissolution and back is documented in the Red Book. Between 1913 and 1916, his boundaries became so permeable that he nearly lost contact with reality entirely. He absorbed his patient's unconscious material completely, experienced prophetic visions that he later understood as participation mystique with the collective unconscious, encountered archetypal figures who threatened to overwhelm his ego consciousness entirely. The anima figures in his visions, Salome, the feminine forces, pulled him toward complete dissolution. They offered merger, cosmic union, the obliteration of separate selfhood. Jung was tempted. Part of him wanted to surrender to it. But Philemon, the wise old man figure, representing developed masculine consciousness, taught him differentiation, showed him how to relate to the unconscious without being consumed by it, how to dialogue with archetypal forces while maintaining ego integrity. The practice Jung developed, active imagination, was specifically designed to solve the empathic dissolution problem. How do you open to powerful psychic forces without losing yourself? How do you feel deeply without merging completely? Answer: strong ego-maintaining, conscious relationship with unconscious content. Boundaries that allow interaction without dissolution. Jung's transformation was complete. He went from nearly psychotic merger with the collective unconscious to becoming the psychologist who could navigate those depths safely and teach others to do the same. His later relationships with patients were different. He maintained clear boundaries, refused to absorb their pathology, and insisted they do their own work. He'd learned, you can't heal anyone through merger. You can only witness their individuation while maintaining your own. The success. Jung became the healer-teacher empaths need, someone who felt deeply, understood profoundly, but remained intact, boundaried, separate. His work exists because he individuated instead of dissolving. Eleanor Roosevelt, from codependent wife to sovereign humanitarian. Eleanor Roosevelt spent the first half of her life in classic empathic dissolution. Married to Franklin, she existed primarily to manage his political career and emotional needs. When she discovered his affair, her identity shattered because it had been entirely constructed around being his wife. The crisis forced individuation. She couldn't return to unconscious merger after the betrayal made it visible. She faced the void. Who was she outside of being Mrs. Roosevelt? The transformation took years. She developed separate interests, independent activism, her own voice and vision. She learned to set boundaries with Franklin, remaining married but creating psychological separation that allowed her to become herself. What emerged was remarkable. An Eleanor Roosevelt with strong ego boundaries who could channel her empathic gift into effective humanitarian work. She felt deeply for suffering people, refugees, the poor, the marginalized, but she didn't merge with their pain. She used it to fuel action while maintaining enough separation to function effectively. Her later writing shows integrated empathy, compassion without codependency, care without caretaking, boundaries without walls. She could say no to Franklin's demands while saying yes to her own calling. Jung would recognize this as successful individuation, someone who transformed empathic dissolution into conscious empathy, who developed strong enough ego structure to channel sensitivity productively rather than being overwhelmed by it. She died at 78, having lived a full, individuated life. Not perfect, no one fully individuates, but whole, real, herself. Brené Brown, Research as Path to Integration. More recently, Brené Brown's journey from shame researcher to vulnerability teacher demonstrates successful navigation of empathic dissolution. Brown's early work shows someone deeply empathic, highly sensitive, and struggling with boundaries. Her research on shame and vulnerability was initially personal, trying to understand her own patterns of people-pleasing, perfectionism, and exhaustion from emotional labor. What she discovered through years of research validated Jung's teaching. True connection requires vulnerability from a place of worthiness, not from emptiness trying to fill itself through others. Her breakdown, which she discusses openly, was a differentiation crisis. Her old identity, built on being who others needed, collapsed. She faced the terror of being separate, having needs, disappointing people. The integration that followed produced her teaching framework. Strong back, soft front, wild heart. This is empathic individuation perfectly articulated. Strong back, ego, strength. Boundaries, the capacity to stand separate. Soft front, open heart. Empathic capacity, willingness to feel. Wild heart, authentic self. Individual calling, sovereign purpose. Brown's success lies in modeling integrated empathy. She feels deeply and maintains boundaries, opens her heart and protects her energy, shows compassion and takes care of herself. Her work helps millions because she individuated first. If she'd remained in empathic dissolution, no boundaries, compulsive caretaking, identity built on being needed, she couldn't teach what she teaches. The pattern is clear. Failed empaths remain in dissolution, producing brilliant work sometimes but never becoming whole. Successful empaths do the individuation work, becoming integrated beings who can channel their sensitivity powerfully because it flows through strong ego structure rather than overwhelming weak boundaries. The question for you: which path will you choose? If even Jung nearly fell into complete empathic dissolution, then we must take this pattern seriously. The man who would eventually teach the world about individuation almost lost himself entirely in participation mystique. This is humanizing and crucial, because if the master of depth psychology struggled with this, then your struggle isn't weakness. It's encountering one of psyche's most powerful and dangerous dynamics. The confrontation with the unconscious, 1913-1916. After his break with Freud, Jung entered what he later called his confrontation with the unconscious. He experienced it as terrifying dissolution, the boundaries between his psyche and the collective unconscious becoming dangerously permeable. He had visions, heard voices, encountered archetypal figures with overwhelming power. His dreams became so vivid they felt more real than waking life. He struggled to maintain his psychiatric practice because he couldn't always distinguish his patient's unconscious material from his own. This wasn't psychosis, though it came close. This was empathic dissolution at the level of the collective. Jung's boundaries had become so permeable that he was absorbing not just individual people's emotions, but the unconscious currents moving through the collective itself. The most dramatic example. In 1914, Jung had recurring visions of Europe drowning in blood, of mass death and destruction. He feared he was becoming psychotic. Then World War I began, and he realized he'd been experiencing participation mystique with the collective unconscious preparing for war. He was literally feeling what millions were about to experience, unable to distinguish that collective movement from his own psychological state. This is empathic dissolution at its most extreme, absorbing not just one person's emotions but civilizational forces. Jung's private notes from this period reveal his terror. "I was afraid I might lose myself completely." He describes feeling like he was drowning, being pulled into an abyss, losing his grip on ego consciousness entirely. The Red Book, document of near dissolution. The Red Book, Jung's private journal during this period, shows the pattern in detail. The feminine figures, Salome, the anima, various goddess forms, all beckoning him toward complete merger. Salome, appearing with Elijah in one vision, represents the temptation of empathic dissolution. She offers union, bliss, the end of separateness. She promises that surrendering ego boundaries will bring cosmic connection. Jung is tempted. He dialogues with her, considers it, feels the pull toward that dissolution. The entries show him wavering. Should he surrender to the merger? Is this spiritual enlightenment or psychological death? Philemon, the wise old man, provides the countervoice. He teaches Jung differentiation, insists on the necessity of ego consciousness, shows him that union without separation is regression, not progress. The dialogues between Jung and these figures are essentially Jung's psyche negotiating whether to dissolve or individuate. The feminine principle pulls toward merger. The masculine principle insists on boundaries. Jung has to consciously choose. He writes, "The spirit of the depths wants union, but the spirit of this time insists on separation." He's torn between archetypal merger, spirit of depths, and conscious individuation, spirit of time. This struggle lasted years, and during that time, Jung's professional life became almost impossible. His empathic boundaries were so compromised that he was experiencing psychic infection from his patients. Psychic infection, the analyst's empathic trap. Jung coined the term psychic infection specifically to describe what happens when an analyst with permeable boundaries works with patients. He was describing himself. He realized he'd been absorbing his patients' unconscious material completely. Their dreams invaded his dreams. Their complexes activated his complexes. Their psychoses threatened his sanity. This is the empathic analyst's greatest danger, using empathic permeability to understand patients while forgetting to maintain separate selfhood. You achieve profound insight into their psyche because you've merged with it. But you lose yourself in the process. Jung describes specific incidents, working with schizophrenic patients and feeling his own ego boundaries begin to dissolve, experiencing paranoid thoughts that were actually his patient's paranoia, absorbed through empathic merger, having to leave his practice for months because he couldn't maintain the separation necessary to function. His personal confession, written later, but never published during his life. "I realized I had been allowing patients' unconscious material to invade my psyche, believing this was necessary for deep understanding. Instead, it nearly destroyed me." He had to learn what he would later teach. The analyst must maintain firm boundaries, must be able to feel with patients without becoming them, must understand deeply while remaining separate. This meant fundamentally changing his approach, establishing what he called professional boundaries, not walls, but clear, ego structure that allowed empathic connection without dissolution. The anima, feminine force demanding surrender. Jung's struggle with the anima, his inner feminine, is documented throughout the Red Book. She appears in various forms, always beckoning him toward dissolution of ego, surrender of boundaries, merger with the unconscious. In one vision, she tells him, "You must lose yourself to find yourself." Jung recognizes this as partially true. Ego must relativize, but also dangerous. Complete ego loss is psychosis, not enlightenment. The anima wants union, wants the boundaries between conscious and unconscious, self and other, human and divine to dissolve. She promises bliss in that dissolution. But Jung recognizes this is the voice that has destroyed countless empathic people, the voice that says dissolving is loving, merging is connecting, losing yourself is finding truth. He has to learn to relate to the anima without being consumed by her, to honor the feminine principle of connection without surrendering the masculine principle of differentiation. This becomes central to his teaching. Individuation requires integrating anima-animus while maintaining ego consciousness. You don't surrender to these forces. You dialogue with them, learn from them, integrate them, while remaining yourself. The active imagination solution, the practice Jung developed to save himself, became his most important technical contribution. Active imagination, a method specifically designed to allow conscious relationship with unconscious content while maintaining ego boundaries. The technique: enter a meditative state, invite unconscious figures to appear, dialogue with them consciously while remaining yourself. Don't identify with them, don't surrender to them. Maintain your ego position while relating to them. This is the solution to empathic dissolution at the level of practice. You can feel, connect, encounter powerful forces while maintaining separation. Jung practiced this daily for years. It's what allowed him to emerge from near-psychosis into integrated wholeness. He learned to encounter Philemon, Salome, the anima, the shadow, without being overwhelmed by them. The key: ego consciousness remains intact and active throughout. You're not passively absorbed. You're actively relating. This is conscious connection versus participation mystique. He later taught this to patients, especially empathic ones struggling with boundary dissolution. Active imagination became the practice for building ego strength while remaining open to deep psychic material. The return: boundaried wisdom. By 1917, Jung had emerged transformed. He still felt deeply, understood profoundly, connected empathically, but now from a place of solid ego structure. He'd survived the dissolution crisis and individuated through it. His later relationships with patients were completely different. He maintained clear boundaries, refused empathic merger, and insisted patients do their own individuation work. He'd learned the hard way. Helping someone through dissolution just creates mutual entanglement. His teaching became emphatic. The analyst must individuate first, must have strong ego boundaries, must be able to encounter the depths without being consumed. He wrote, "The doctor must be aware of the dangers of psychic infection and guard against them." This wasn't abstract theory, this was his survival wisdom. In seminars, Jung would warn young analysts, "Your empathy can destroy you if you haven't developed ego strength first. You'll believe you're being helpful when you're actually merging pathologically." He described seeing countless young therapists burn out or develop psychological problems themselves because they confused empathic merger with therapeutic connection. The warning for empaths. Jung's message to empaths based on his own near destruction: your sensitivity is real, your capacity to feel deeply is genuine, but without ego development it will consume you. You cannot skip the individuation work. You cannot remain in participation mystique and expect to thrive. You cannot keep merging and calling it love. The unconscious is powerful. Others' emotional fields are real. The collective forces are vast. If you remain permeable without strong ego boundaries, they will overwhelm you. Jung himself, the most psychologically sophisticated person of the 20th century, nearly lost himself completely. If he struggled, then your struggle is not weakness. It's the magnitude of the forces you're dealing with. But his success proves it's possible. You can develop ego strength without losing empathic capacity. You can build boundaries without building walls. You can individuate into boundaried wholeness while remaining deeply feeling. His path is the path. Shadow integration, projection withdrawal, ego strengthening, active imagination, differentiation from others, anima-animus integration. This is how empaths survive and thrive. The legacy Jung's near dissolution and subsequent recovery gave the world individuation psychology. If he'd stayed merged, he couldn't have developed the teaching. If he'd closed down completely, he'd have lost his depth. Instead, he found the middle path. Strong ego maintaining conscious relationship with deep psychic forces. Boundaries that allow encounter without being overwhelmed. Separation that makes genuine connection possible. This is his gift to empaths. You don't have to choose between dissolving or closing down. There's a third option, individuate. Build strong enough ego structure to contain your sensitivity rather than being consumed by it. He proved it's possible, and his teaching provides the map. The question is whether you'll walk the path he walked, whether you'll do the work he did, whether you'll survive the crisis he survived. Most won't. They'll read this, recognize themselves, and stay in dissolution because it's familiar. They'll choose the known suffering over the unknown, terror of becoming separate. But for those ready, for those who can't continue disappearing, Jung's journey shows it's possible. The empath can become individuated. The dissolved can become whole. The person who felt everything can learn to feel themselves. You just have to be willing to do what Jung did. Face the terror of separateness and survive it. Theory without practice is useless. Understanding the pattern doesn't heal it. You need concrete daily practices that actually build the ego structure and boundaries you're lacking. These 7 practices are adapted from Jung's work, contemporary depth psychology, and somatic trauma healing. Each one addresses a specific aspect of empathic dissolution. Together, they create a comprehensive individuation program you can implement immediately. Fair warning, these practices will feel wrong, selfish, and terrifying, especially at first. That feeling is how you know they're working. They're interrupting lifelong patterns and your psyche will resist. Do them anyway. Practice 1. The daily separation ritual, 15 minutes morning. This foundational practice establishes psychological boundaries before you encounter anyone else's emotional field. The practice, immediately upon waking, before checking your phone or engaging with others, sit in a quiet space. Close your eyes. Take 3 deep breaths, feeling your own body's boundaries. Skin, edges, the space you occupy. Place your hands on your chest and say aloud, "This is me. I am separate. I am whole." Visualize your body outlined in light, a clear, distinct boundary separating your internal experience from external influences. See this boundary as semi-permeable. You can let things in consciously, but nothing enters without your permission. Practice the mantra, "Their feelings are theirs. My feelings are mine." I can feel compassion without absorption. Scan your body. Notice any emotional residue from yesterday or dreams. Ask, is this mine or did I absorb this from someone? If it feels absorbed, visualize returning it to whoever it belongs to. See it leaving your energy field. Set your intention for the day. Today, I will notice when I'm absorbing others' emotions. When I notice, I will consciously separate. That's yours. This is mine. End by placing both hands on your belly and breathing into your own center. Feel yourself as a distinct being, sovereign and whole. Why this works? Your nervous system needs daily recalibration because empathic dissolution has trained it to scan for others before checking yourself. This ritual establishes self-awareness before other awareness, reversing the habitual pattern. The verbal declarations activate conscious ego function. The visualization builds energetic boundaries. The intention setting primes your awareness to catch absorption moments in real time. Resistance you'll feel. This feels selfish. I don't have time. This isn't working. I still feel everything. This is just self-help nonsense. Do it. Anyway, for 30 days minimum, the resistance is your system defending dissolution because separation feels dangerous. Push through. Practice 2. Shadow reclamation journaling, 20 minutes, evening. Empaths have exiled vast amounts of their authentic self to become acceptable. This practice systematically reclaims what you've rejected. The practice. Each evening, spend 20 minutes writing responses to these prompts. Rotate through them daily. Week 1. Prompts. Identifying shadow material. What quality do I most judge in others? When have I displayed this quality? What am I certain I'm not? Find 3 examples from my life where I was actually that. Who did I strongly dislike or feel threatened by this week? What quality in them bothers me most? Do I possess this quality in any form? Week 2. Prompts. Understanding shadow function. What is this rejected part trying to protect me from? How has exiling this quality limited my life? What would become possible if I integrated this quality consciously? Week 3. Prompts. Shadow dialogue. Write as your rejected part. I am the anger you exiled. Here's what I want you to know. Let the shadow quality speak fully. Don't censor. Let it explain its purpose, its pain, what it needs from you. Week 4. Prompts. Integration. How can I express this quality appropriately in my life? Where do I need more anger, selfishness, desire, ambition right now? What would healthy expression of this quality look like? Advanced practice. Once you've identified core shadow material, do active imagination dialogues. Close your eyes, invite the shadow figure, angry self, selfish self, abandoning self. Ask it directly, what do you need from me? How can we integrate? Let it respond. Write what emerges. This builds conscious relationship with disowned parts. Why this works. Shadow material doesn't disappear when exiled. It operates unconsciously, often projected onto others. Systematic reclamation withdraws projections, integrates split-off parts, and builds authentic wholeness. Jung emphasized, you can't individuate without shadow work. You can't have boundaries without reclaiming what you've made other in yourself. Resistance you'll feel, I don't have these qualities, that's not me. This is making me feel worse about myself. I found some shadow stuff, but I don't know what to do with it. The first resistance is denial. The shadow defends itself. Push deeper. The second is shame. You're seeing what you've judged. Have compassion. The third is impatience. Integration takes time. Trust the process. Practice 3. Projection withdrawal exercise, 10 minutes as needed. This practice catches projection in real time and systematically takes it back. The practice. Whenever you sense something strongly about someone, especially if you feel certain about their emotional state, motivations, or thoughts, stop. Get out a piece of paper or phone notes app. Answer these questions. What am I sensing? Be specific. I sense they're angry at me, or I sense they want to leave. How certain am I? Rate 1-10. Projections feel extremely certain, usually 8 to 10. What evidence do I have? List only objective facts, not interpretations. Could this be mine? Am I angry? Do I want to leave? Is this quality something I've exiled? Have I checked with them? If not, what stops me from asking directly? Then, if possible, reality test. I'm sensing you're angry. Is that accurate? When they say no, believe them. Notice your resistance to believing them. That's the projection holding on. If you can't check immediately, write, I'm sensing X in them, but this might be my projection of my own, X. I'll hold this lightly until I can verify. Weekly review. Every Sunday, review your week's projection tracking. Look for patterns. Do you consistently project anxiety, anger, desire to leave? Which people trigger most projections? Usually those carrying your shadow. How often were your intuitions accurate versus projection? Over time, you'll recognize your projection signature, the specific material you consistently place in others. Why this works. Empaths believe their perceptions are intuition. Usually, it's projection. This practice builds the muscle of questioning your certainty, reality testing, and taking back what's yours. Each projection withdrawal strengthens ego boundaries. You're reclaiming what you've made external, building internal awareness. Resistance you'll feel, but I know what they're feeling. I'm right. This is making me doubt my intuition. They're lying when they say they don't feel that. The stronger your resistance, the more likely it's projection. Real intuition holds lightly, remains open. Projection insists with absolute certainty. Practice. 4. The Sovereign Self-Meditation, 15 minutes, 3x weekly. This active imagination practice builds relationship with your individuated self, the person you're becoming through boundary development. The practice. Sit comfortably, close eyes. Take several deep breaths, settling into your body. Invite an image of your sovereign self, the version of you that is fully individuated, boundaried, whole. Don't force an image. Let it emerge naturally. It might appear as an older, wiser version of you, a figure of power and groundedness, an image that feels completely solid and separate, sometimes just a feeling of strong presence. Once the image stabilizes, dialogue with it. How does it feel to have intact boundaries? Listen. Let the sovereign self respond. You might hear words, feel sensations, or simply receive knowing. Trust what emerges. What do I need to learn from you? How do you handle others' disappointment when you set boundaries? What does healthy selfishness look like? Show me what it's like to feel compassion without absorption. Spend 10-15 minutes in this dialogue. Let the sovereign self teach you. Sometimes it will show you scenes, how it handles difficult conversations, makes decisions, stays centered when others are upset. End by thanking this figure and affirming, you are my future self. I am becoming you. Journaling after, immediately write what emerged. The teachings, sensations, images. This integrates the experience and builds the neural pathway toward this version of yourself. Why this works. Jung taught that the psyche contains templates for wholeness. Your sovereign self already exists as potentiality in the unconscious. This practice makes it conscious, giving you an internal guide for the individuation journey. Over time, this figure becomes a felt resource. In difficult moments, you can ask, what would my sovereign self do here? Resistance you'll feel. Nothing appeared. I'm doing it wrong. This feels like I'm just making it up. This seems narcissistic, imagining some perfect version of myself. Images take time to form. Keep practicing. Yes, you're using imagination. That's the point. Jung's active imagination works through imagination to access deeper truth. And you're not creating grandiosity. You're building healthy ego structure. Practice 5. Radical no. Practice. Weekly graduated exposure. Empaths can't say no without massive anxiety. This practice systematically builds that capacity. Week 1 to 2, baby no's. Say no to one small request per day. Don't explain, justify, or apologize. Just, no, that doesn't work for me, or no, I'm not available for that. Examples. Friend asks you to listen to their problems. I don't have capacity for that right now. Someone asks for a favor. No, I can't help with that. Invitation you don't want. No, but thanks for asking. Week 3, 4, medium no's. Say no to something you'd normally say yes to out of guilt or obligation. Examples, family gathering you don't want to attend. Taking on extra work to help a colleague, lending money to someone who hasn't repaid you before practice, sitting with their disappointment without trying to fix it, explain more, or take back your no. Week 5 and 6. Major no's. Set a boundary that contradicts your empathic identity. Examples, I can't be your therapist anymore. You need to find professional help. I'm taking a break from our friendship because it's become one-sided. I'm leaving this relationship. It's not working for me. The critical component. After each no, do not apologize excessively. Explain at length. Try to manage their feelings about your no. Take back the boundary. Do notice your anxiety. It's your nervous system predicting abandonment, old programming. Breathe through the discomfort. Remind yourself, their disappointment is not my emergency. Journal, I said no. I felt anxiety, guilt, terror. I survived. They survived. Why this works. Every no you survive while staying separate reprograms your nervous system. You're proving setting boundaries doesn't equal death. People's disappointment is tolerable. You can prioritize yourself and relationships continue. This is exposure therapy for boundary setting. The only way out is through. Resistance you'll feel, massive anxiety, physical sensations of danger, conviction you're destroying the relationship, guilt that feels unbearable, urge to take back the no and restore peace. These feelings are your system resisting change. They're not accurate reality assessment. Feel them fully while maintaining your boundary. This is the differentiation crisis in microcosm. Practice 6, emotional differentiation tracking throughout the day. This practice develops the crucial skill of distinguishing your emotions from absorbed emotions. The practice, carry a small notebook or use phone notes. Throughout the day, when you feel an emotion, pause and track it using the 3-part framework. 1. Their emotion, what they're experiencing. 2. My emotion, what I'm actually feeling. 3. My reaction, what I want to do in response. Example. 1. Their emotion, partner is anxious about work presentation. My emotion, I feel tender toward their struggle, also frustrated this is consuming our evening. My reaction, I want to fix their anxiety by preparing them extensively, which would mean abandoning my own plans. Example 2, their emotion, friend is sad about breakup. My emotion, compassionate, also relieved. This person is out of their life. They were toxic. My reaction, want to only validate sadness, suppress my relief, take on project of making them feel better. Example 3, their emotion, co-worker seems irritated. My emotion, anxious, scanning for what I did wrong. My reaction, want to fix whatever's bothering them, make them less irritated. The critical step, after tracking, ask, what's actually mine to feel or do here? Often, their emotion is theirs to handle. Your emotion is worth honoring, even if it contradicts empathic identity. Your reaction impulse is usually codependent. Don't act on it automatically. Weekly pattern analysis. Every Sunday, review your tracking. Notice, how often were you absorbing their emotion as your own before tracking? Which relationships trigger most absorption? Which emotions do you consistently struggle to differentiate? Anxiety, anger, sadness. What reactions do you habitually have? Fix, rescue, manage, absorb. Why this works? Empaths experience emotional fusion as normal. This practice builds the differentiation muscle. Over time, you'll automatically distinguish theirs, mine, my reaction without conscious tracking. This is ego strengthening in action, developing self-awareness as distinct from other awareness. Resistance you'll feel. This feels cold. I should just respond naturally. I can't track in the moment. It disrupts connection. This is making me less empathic. You're not becoming cold. You're becoming boundaried. The tracking feels disruptive because you're used to automatic absorption. And you're not becoming less empathic. You're developing real empathy that comes from separation, not merger. Practice 7. The Narcissist Detector Protocol. Use when meeting new people or early in relationships. Empaths attract narcissists reliably. This practice catches the dynamic early before you're entangled. The checklist. When meeting someone new or early in dating friendship, track these red flags. Week 1 or 3. Observations. Do they ask about you with genuine interest or only talk about themselves? When you share something vulnerable, do they respond with empathy or redirect to their experience? Do they respect your time and boundaries or expect immediate availability? Do they validate your feelings or tell you how you should feel? Do you feel energized after time together or drained? Week 4A8. Deeper flags. Do they take responsibility for mistakes or blame others due to circumstances? Can they handle you saying no without guilt tripping or withdrawal? Do they celebrate your successes or somehow make them about themselves? Are they curious about your inner world or only interested in what you provide them? Do they have other healthy relationships or is everyone else crazy, toxic? The decisive test. Set a clear boundary about something meaningful. Notice their response. Healthy response. Respects boundary. Maybe discusses it. Ultimately honors your need. Narcissistic response. Guilt trips. Becomes angry. Withdraws affection. Makes you the problem. Eventually violates the boundary while blaming you. Your internal check. Ask yourself honestly. Am I drawn to this person because they need me? Red flag. Do I feel like I can fix, heal, help them? Red flag. Is the intensity between us feeling like deep connection? Often trauma bonding, not intimacy. Am I already making excuses for concerning behaviors? You're doing it again. Do I feel like myself around them, or am I adapting, performing? Identity evacuation beginning. The hard rule. If you've identified 5+ red flags in first 3 months, get out. Don't wait to see if they change. Don't think, but they have so much potential. Don't believe they just need someone who understands them. They need therapy, not your codependent caretaking, and you need to protect your recovery. Why this works. Awareness is prevention. Empaths get entangled before they recognize the pattern. This protocol catches narcissistic dynamics at the dating friendship stage before deep attachment forms. It's not about demonizing narcissists. It's about recognizing you're not equipped to be in relationship with them while you're still building ego boundaries. Maybe later, once you're individuated. Not now. Resistance you'll feel. I'm being too judgmental. Everyone has flaws. I'm not giving them a fair chance. This feels too clinical. I should follow my heart. Your heart is actually your wound seeking familiar dysfunction. Your judgment is finally waking up. Healthy people don't mind being evaluated for compatibility. Only narcissists insist you shouldn't have boundaries or standards. Implementation protocol. Don't try to implement all 7 practices immediately. Start with practices 1, 3, and 6. They're foundational and manageable. After 2 weeks, add practice 2 and 5. After a month, integrate practice 4 and 7. Track your experience. Journal what changes. Notice resistance and work with it rather than letting it stop you. These practices, done consistently, will transform your psychological structure over 6 to 12 months. You'll notice less exhaustion after social interaction, ability to identify your own feelings, capacity to say no without collapsing, reduced attraction to narcissists, emerging sense of separate selfhood, moments of genuine peace in your own company. This is individuation in action, not theory, practice. The question is whether you'll do it. Understanding the complete journey helps tremendously. You need to know, where am I now? What comes next? How long will this take? What does the destination look like? Jung mapped the individuation process through identifiable stages. For empaths moving from dissolution to sovereignty, the journey follows a predictable arc. Knowing this normalizes the experience and provides hope when you're in the most difficult phases. Total timeline, 2 to 5 years typically, depending on the depth of dissolution and consistency of practice. Some phases last months, others a year or more. The journey is spiral, not linear. You'll revisit earlier phases at deeper levels. Stage 1, the recognition crisis, duration, weeks to 3 months. What's happening? This is where you are now if you've read this far and recognized yourself. The veil lifts. You suddenly see that your empathic gift might be a wound, that your sensitivity might be trauma adaptation, that your entire identity might be built on dissolution rather than wholeness. This recognition is simultaneously liberating and terrifying. Liberation because finally someone has named what you've been experiencing. Terror because if you're not the special empath, who are you? Psychological characteristics. Fluctuation between yes, this is me, and no, I'm not that bad. Grief at recognizing years wasted in unhealthy patterns. Anger at people who used your dissolved state. Fear about what change would mean. Guilt about considering boundaries. Won't that make you selfish? Confusion about what to do with this awareness. Common dreams, waking up or emerging from water. Seeing yourself clearly for first time in a mirror. Discovery of hidden rooms in your house, psyche. Being told a difficult truth by a wise figure. What helps? Validation that what you're seeing is real information. Reading, videos, therapy that explains the pattern, beginning to track the pattern in real time. There, I just absorbed that. Finding others who understand. Groups, communities, therapists specializing in this. Being gentle with yourself. This recognition is hard enough without self-attack. What doesn't help? Trying to immediately fix everything. Judging yourself harshly for the pattern, expecting others to understand. Most won't. Making major life decisions in the shock of recognition. The danger. Intellectualizing without changing. Understanding the pattern perfectly while continuing it. Using awareness as another form of self-attack rather than as doorway to transformation. Moving forward, you move to stage 2 when you decide, I can't keep living like this. I have to change even though I don't know how. This decision, genuine commitment to transformation, despite terror, opens the next phase. Stage 2, the boundary experiment, duration 3-12 months. What's happening? You begin practicing boundaries, saying no, setting limits, trying to stay separate when every instinct screams to merge. This is experimental. You're testing whether you can actually do this, whether relationships will survive, whether you'll survive. Everything feels wrong. Boundaries feel selfish. Saying no feels cruel. Choosing yourself feels like betrayal. Your nervous system is in constant activation because you're violating its primary programming. Merger equals survival. Psychological characteristics. Intense anxiety when setting boundaries. Physical sensations of danger, racing heart, nausea, shaking, compulsion to take back every boundary you set. Hypervigilance to others' reactions. Guilt that feels unbearable. Surprise when boundaries don't cause the catastrophe you predicted. Exhaustion from fighting your own programming. Relational impact. relationships begin changing. Some people get angry. They were benefiting from your boundarylessness. Some withdraw. They don't know how to relate to you with limits. Some adjust. These are the healthy ones worth keeping. You might lose friendships, face family conflict, or have relationship crises. This is normal. Your system changes, destabilize systems built on your dissolution. Common dreams, building walls or doors where there were none, pushing people away or saying no powerfully, being attacked for having boundaries, protection figures appearing, warriors, guards, fierce animals, sometimes nightmares of abandonment, your fear manifesting. What helps? Tracking every boundary you set and its actual outcome. Usually, nothing catastrophic happened. Somatic practices for managing anxiety, breathwork, movement, grounding, therapy, or coaching from someone who won't coddle you. Mantras, their disappointment isn't my emergency. Celebrating tiny victories, I said no and didn't explain for 20 minutes. What doesn't help? Expecting boundaries to feel good immediately. They won't, they'll feel terrible. Comparing yourself to naturally boundaried people, they didn't have to build from nothing. Abandoning practice when it gets hard. Surrounding yourself with people who reinforce your old identity. The danger. Boundary inflation. Swinging from no boundaries to rigid walls. Becoming cold, defended, withdrawn rather than boundaried and open. Using boundaries to rationalize cruelty. Or giving up, deciding it's too hard and collapsing back into familiar dissolution. Many people don't make it past this stage. Moving forward, you enter stage 3 when boundaries start feeling slightly less terrifying and you notice, I'm still here, I set boundaries and I still exist. People are still in my life, though maybe different people. The transition happens when the pain of staying boundaried becomes less than the pain of merging again. When you've tasted enough sovereignty that you can't unknow what separation feels like. Stage 3, the identity desert. Duration, 6-18 months. What's happening? This is the hardest phase, the dark night of the soul for empaths. You've dismantled the old identity, empath, caretaker, the one who feels everything, but you haven't yet built a new one. You're in the desert between who you were and who you're becoming. There's vast emptiness, no familiar roles to hide in, no clear sense of self yet emerged, just void. You've exited relationships that only worked through merger, stopped caretaking compulsively, withdrawn from communities that reinforced your old identity, and now you're alone in a way you've never been. Psychological characteristics, profound disorientation about identity, who am I? Loneliness that feels existential, grief for the years lost to dissolution, anger emerging, often explosive, messy, scary depression as the false self dies, strange sense of unreality, depersonalization, boredom with normal life after years of intensity, fear you've made a terrible mistake dismantling your old life, the temptation, return to dissolution, find someone who needs you, jump into a relationship for relief, take on someone's problems to feel purposeful again. The pull toward familiar suffering is enormous because this void feels unbearable. Common dreams, wandering in deserts or empty landscapes, being invisible or having no face, dying or watching your old self die. Sometimes rebirth imagery starting to appear, eggs, seeds, cocoons. What helps? Sitting with the void without filling it, hardest practice there is. Creative expression, art, writing, music, that doesn't serve others, nature immersion. You're reorganizing at deep level. Nature supports this. Somatic work, the new self, forms in the body before the mind. Therapy that normalizes this phase rather than tries to fix it. Journaling, what wants to emerge through this emptiness? What doesn't help? Rushing to fill the void with new identity. Jumping into new relationship to escape loneliness. Constant distraction from the discomfort. Judging yourself for being stuck. Comparing your process to others. The danger. This is where many people relapse into old patterns. The void feels too empty, the loneliness too acute, the grief too overwhelming. They return to caretaking, merge with someone new, resume the familiar dissolution because it feels safer than this terrifying unknown. Or they flee into spiritual bypass. I'm experiencing ego death, this is enlightenment, without doing the actual work of building a self. Moving forward, you emerge from the desert when something begins, a stirring, a preference, a desire that's actually yours, a boundary that feels natural rather than effortful, a sense of I like this or I want that comes from inside, not from reading someone else. The transition happens when the void starts feeling less empty and more like pregnant potential. When you notice, I'm becoming someone, I don't know who yet, but someone's forming. Stage 4. The self-emergence, duration 6 to 12 months. What's happening? The new self begins forming. Preferences crystallize, desires become clear. You start knowing what you want without checking what others want first. You discover who you are in solitude, and it's not empty anymore. This is thrilling and disorienting. You're meeting yourself, often for the first time, and this self is different from who you thought you were. Maybe quieter, maybe more ambitious, maybe more selfish, maybe surprisingly content with simple things. Psychological characteristics, excitement about self-discovery, surprising preferences emerging. I actually hate being around large groups. Clear nose without guilt, enjoyment of a solitude, shocking after years of needing others. Creative energy returning, anger about lost years, healthy anger now, not just rage. Less tolerance for bullshit, surprising confidence in certain areas. Grief mixed with joy, mourning who you could have been while celebrating who you're becoming. Relational changes. You're different. People notice. Some love this version of you. Others miss the old, disappeared you because you were easier to use. You might feel lonely even though you're becoming whole, because you're outgrowing old relationships and haven't yet found new ones that fit your emerging self. Common dreams, building something new, pregnancy or birth imagery, finding treasure or valuable objects, strong, solid structures appearing, animals representing power and boundaries, lions, bears, wolves, meeting your future self. What helps? Following your emerging preferences even when they surprise you, saying yes to what genuinely interests you, revolutionary after years of adapting to others, dating yourself, taking yourself on solo adventures, journaling, who am I becoming, celebrating every authentic desire or preference that emerges, building new relationships slowly with people who meet you as you are now. What doesn't help? Judging your emerging self, I'm too selfish now, trying to return to old relationships that don't fit anymore, rushing into new intense relationships before your self solidifies, apologizing for being different. The danger, narcissistic flip, inflating around your recovery, becoming grandiose about being healed or boundaried, developing superiority about people still in dissolution, secret pride in being evolved now. This is shadow narcissism, emerging as your ego strengthens. It needs integration, not inflation. Moving forward, you enter stage 5 when your new self feels relatively stable, when you can maintain boundaries without constant effort, when you genuinely like yourself and your own company, when you're ready to try relationships again, but from wholeness, not need. Stage 5, conscious empathy from sovereignty, duration, ongoing integration. What's happening? You've arrived. Not at perfection. No one fully completes individuation, but at sustainable wholeness. You have a self, boundaries that flex appropriately, the capacity for genuine empathy that comes from strength, not weakness. You can feel deeply without losing yourself, Connect intimately without merging. Love without dissolving. Choose relationships consciously rather than compulsively. This is the integrated empath Jung envisioned. Someone whose sensitivity is channeled through strong ego structure rather than overwhelming weak boundaries. Psychological characteristics: stable sense of self across contexts, empathy that's conscious and boundaried, capacity to say no without guilt, enjoyment of both connection and solitude, clear knowing of what's yours versus theirs, sustainable relationships characterized by reciprocity, occasional regression to old patterns, but you catch it quickly, deep satisfaction in living authentically, compassion without codependency. Relational quality: your relationships are completely different. You're attracted to healthy, boundaried people. Narcissists no longer appeal. They seem one-dimensional, exhausting. Drama feels draining rather than exciting. You can be in relationship without losing yourself, have intimate moments without merging, support others without rescuing, receive care without shame. Common dreams: partnership between equals, building sustainable structures together, balanced imagery, scales, partnerships, reciprocity. Sometimes return to earlier phase dreams, spiral process, but you handle them differently. What helps? Ongoing practice. Boundaries still need maintenance. Community with other individuated empaths. Regular self-check-ins. Am I staying separate? Continued shadow work as new layers emerge. Willingness to keep learning and growing the danger. Complacency, thinking you're done. Forgetting that individuation is lifelong process. Resting on your transformation laurels while slowly slipping back into old patterns. Or becoming rigid. Boundaries become walls, protecting your sovereignty so fiercely you can't be vulnerable. Confusing healthy boundaries with defended isolation. Ongoing work. At this stage, you're maintaining and deepening, noticing when stress causes temporary boundary collapse and reestablishing quickly, continuing to discover new layers of self, allowing relationships to evolve, living from sovereignty while staying open-hearted, the spiral nature. Even at stage 5, you'll revisit earlier stages. A major loss might trigger stage 3 desert again. A new intense relationship might test your stage 2 boundaries. This isn't failure, it's the spiral path of growth. Each time you revisit, you move through faster and with more consciousness. The patterns don't disappear completely. They become increasingly conscious, and you catch them earlier. Timeline reality. This isn't quick work. Most people take 3 to 5 years from recognition to sustained sovereignty. Some take longer if the dissolution was severe or early trauma was extreme. This isn't failure. It's the nature of building a self from scratch. You're doing developmental work that should have happened in childhood. It takes time. The promise: if you stay with it, through the terror of stage 2, the void of stage 3, the emergence of stage 4, you arrive at stage 5. A place where you finally know who you are, where you can love without disappearing, where your empathy is a gift channeled through boundaries rather than a wound bleeding all over everyone. You become the person you were always meant to be, yourself. Even committed seekers get derailed. The individuation path is treacherous, filled with subtle traps that can arrest development or send you sideways. Jung documented these failures repeatedly. People who recognized their patterns, began the work, and then got caught in one of these pitfalls. Awareness of these traps helps you avoid them, or recognize when you've fallen in and course correct before too much damage is done.